The Deptford Histories. Thomas, written by Robin Jarvis, read by Richard Griffiths. Side 1. Gwen Triton put down the little square of cotton which she was attempting to embroider and passed a weary paw over her tired eyes. As she waited for her husband to return to their quarters on board the Cutty Sark, the mouse sighed and gazed wistfully round at a few pictures that her children had drawn when they were very young. She thought of them now with a mixture of sorrow and pride. How grown up they both were. Her daughter Audrey had occupied the august office of the Star Wife for some time and ruled the squirrel colony of Greenwich. And Gwen's son, Arthur Brown, had quickly grown impatient with life aboard the Cutty Sark and left for good, leading a large pack of other discontented youngsters. He'd led them through the sewers to the old mouse tunnels of Holborn, where he was now the new Thane of the city, Gwen had heard. Suddenly, Gwen snapped out of her thoughts. Into the cosy candlelit room strode her husband. With a shudder, Gwen recognized the foul humour that had overwhelmed him. "Thomas, come and sit down, please, dear." He glowered at her, and, lunging for a leather flask, he poured its contents into a bowl. "You said you weren't going to touch that any more," Gwen reminded him gently. "This is my only release. The only way to dull the bite of that old wound. It seems to have been gnawing you rather a lot of late. I was thinking, dear, if you can't tell me, why don't you write it down? You never know, it could exorcise your demons for good." Thomas looked into her soft brown eyes and mumbled, "Aye, ain't no harm in trying." As Gwen tiptoed quietly away, Thomas sat himself down and, for the first time in years, summoned to the fore those thoughts which he had so desperately attempted to forget. It was long ago, when he was a mouse eager to see the world, that it first began. He'd made the mistake of setting out upon his journey just before one of the worst winters, and he recalled how he'd found shelter in a quaint and ramshackle farmhouse where a community of field mice took him in and made him welcome. And then one grinning face appeared before him, as he knew it would, and the sturdy seafarer's heart quailed within his breast. "Would it?" he whispered. "Forgive me." It was the morning of the great spring celebration, and the field mice, who'd taken refuge within the farmhouse over the harsh winter months, were at last ready to move out. A group of yawning but excited figures emerged from the farmhouse and scurried across the yard, each of them laden with carefully prepared decorations. When 2 hours had passed, the clearing in the meadow was filled with the heady sweetness of hawthorn, and a delicious feast had been spread upon the ground. Everyone loved this time of year, and though their stomachs were growling, they waited patiently for the end of the ceremony of the mouse-browse giving to those youngsters come of age before they tucked into the food. Standing a little apart from the main group, a lovely young mouse-maiden with curling tresses of chestnut-coloured hair closed her soft brown eyes and lifted her face to the warm sunshine. Bess Sandybrook was a kindly creature, whose sweet nature had made her a favourite among those who dwelt on the farm. With a smile traced upon her comely features, she idly fingered her own mouse-browse which she had been given the previous year. Suddenly a ghostly moan issued out over the meadow, and the assembly giggled, knowing that it was only someone in the chamber of winter trying to scare the youngster passing through. Bess grinned as she recognized that hollow voice. It belonged to her lifelong friend, Woodget Pipple, and she laughed softly, thinking of her small companion's delight at the prospect of taking part in the ceremony this year, and how he'd spent several evenings making a ghost costume. Bess was very fond of Woodget, but she forgot about him for an instant when a second voice, deeper this time, came echoing from the hedge. Undoubtedly, that was Thomas Stubbs, and the mousemaid hugged her knees and nibbled a length of grass as she took time to consider this handsome outsider. He was a fine young mouse with a proud and defiant air about him that demanded respect, and in the brief time he'd been at Bethany Bank Farm he'd made many friends. None, however, were as close to him as the small field mouse presently endeavouring to disengage himself from his ghost costume, and with a hearty laugh Thomas ran across and tore the hood away. Woodgett Pipple let out a grateful sigh. "Oh, thank ye, Tom. I did think I were lost for good in there." "You're a wicked pair," said Bess. "Come on, Bess, lass," Woodgett squeaked as the green revels commenced. "Let's you and me go show Tom how we country folk can frolic." Propped upon his elbows, Thomas watched them skip into the midst of the other gathering dancers, but a furrow creased his young brow. Although he loved both of those happy mice dearly, he almost resented them being together and enjoying themselves without him. 2 more tunes and dances passed before the others returned, hot and breathless, but bearing a jug of berry brew from the feast. "Here, are, Tom," Woodgett said, passing him a bowl. "Right good stuff this is." Thomas gulped it down, then opened his mouth and gasped loudly as the powerful drink tingled on his tongue, and his eyes began to water. "Oh, poor Tommy," Bess cried, throwing her arms about him. "It's as strong brew to sup as your first, but I'll have this next dance if you don't mind." With his berry brew in his little pink paws, Woodgett regarded them contentedly as into the evening the music played. Later, when the first jug of berry brew was emptied and the second was only half full, Master Stubbs and Pipple were momentarily alone under the leaves of the hawthorn tree. "I love her, Woodge," Thomas muttered. "She's the loveliest maid on the good green's earth. Tonight I'll ask for her paw in marriage." Woodgett said nothing, but his world had crashed in around him, for he too had thought that one day he and Bess might wed. Oblivious to his friend's despair, Thomas scrambled to his feet. "Right, this is it. Now or never. I'm going to ask her." In a moment he was gone to where Bess was chatting to a group of her friends. He began. "What is it, Tommy?" Bess asked. "No more dancing for a while." Thomas caught hold of her arm. "It isn't about the dancing." Bess raised her eyebrows questioningly, but allowed him to lead her away from the main gathering. "What I say is this, then," Thomas finally spluttered. "Will you be my wife? I'll be a good husband, the sea won't never tempt me. That was just a boyish fancy." Bess bit her lip anxiously. "Oh, Thomas, I likes you, but that's all there is. My heart belongs to another. I love Woodgett. We've always been together and always will." There was an awkward silence, broken only by a miserable sniff from Thomas's nose. "Oh, don't take it so hard, Tommy. We can still be friends, can't we?" "Well, he's mighty lucky to have you, Bess. I think you'd best get back to him." Bess nodded and began walking back the way they'd come. "Right tomfool you are," Thomas rebuked himself aloud, but a few moments later his wallowing thoughts were interrupted by a heartfelt cry. In a trice Thomas bounded back to the clearing. "Thomas!" Bess cried, racing towards him, clutching a scrap of paper in her paw. "He's gone! Look!" With trembling fingers, Thomas uncrumpled the note. "To Tom and Bess. I never reckoned you were keen on each other. Now I feel as though I've been getting in the way all this time, so I don't fancy staying in Bethany Bank no more. I ain't much good at my letters, so I'll say good-bye here and have done, Woodgett." Thomas raised his eyes from the paper, and his face was set and grave. "This is my fault. But I know where he's bound. There's only one place he'd go." Bess gazed at him fearfully as the truth dawned on her. "The harbour. He's going to catch a ship. Oh, bring him back to me, Tommy." The mouse took her paws in his and looked steadily into her tearful eyes. "I swear it, Bess." And with that, Thomas ran from the yard. A peaceful calm lay over the small harbour, and with a contented, graceful motion the fishing boats rose and fell upon the gently lapping waves. As the night deepened and the gulls sleepily rode the waves, a small and solitary figure wended his sorry way down the path from the grassy hills, and stood stock still when the vast expanse of the great midnight sea ranged into view. Woodgett gazed at the limitless waters and held his breath. Oaks and ivy. I did think the barley field were big, but that were as an acorn is to a forest. Would take a lifetime and more to cross that, and no mistake. Cautiously he picked his way over the quay, but as his tiny feet pattered over coiling ropes which smelled of pitch and tar, he suddenly became aware that he was not alone. Scampering around the screening crates and barrel towers, to his surprise, Woodgett discovered a number of stalls set out in the middle of the thoroughfare as if it were a kind of market. The proprietors were mainly mice, but here and there he noticed other creatures fussing over the carefully laid-out trestles and vying for the attention of the passers-by. "Hi there!" cried a blousy shrew. "If you're setting off tonight, you can't afford to miss these, my lovely." Woodgett looked at the objects laid out on a stall and considered them dubiously. They seemed to consist of a loop of string onto which had been threaded a lump of cork no bigger than his own tiny fist. "Can you swim?" "I thought not." "Well, fear no more. Just one of these round your neck will keep your head above water. 3, and you can sail home all on your own sum." How much are they?" "Oh, piece of silver for 1, 3 pieces for 2. The field mouse furrowed his brow. "Well, I don't believe I got no silver." The shrew's eye fixed upon the tantalizing contents of her victim's bag. "You just hand over that there bag of yourn, and we'll see if there ain't something worth trading." Woodgett passed it over. "What's this? A brooch?" "My mum's that were." The shrew held the ornament up to the candlelight and tried to hide the delight she felt. "Wow," she began with a half-hearted drawl. "There ain't much here, is there?" But her black eyes glittered almost as much as the brooch she still held in her paw. "I suppose I could trade you one for this." "Oh, done!" Woodgett cried. With a triumphant smirk upon her face, the shrew received her booty and handed him one of her worthless pendants. By the time Woodgett came through the far side of the market, he had lost not only his mother's brooch, but also his knife, a brass buckle, a handkerchief, his pewter bowl, and a tin pot. Away from the cheerfully lit stalls, Woodgett began to grow nervous again as lakes of shadow spread out before him. Then his keen ears heard a peculiar tapping noise coming from directly in front of him. What in the barley can that be? Tap, tap, tap. Then the muttering began. Hastily, Woodgett scurried to one side and dived smartly into the deepest depths of a mass of fishing nets. "Spies everywhere," he heard the voice grumble. "I can smell out one of them Weasley venom-hearted snakes come at 100 leagues, that I can." Woodgett dared to raise his head a little from the netting, and noticed that in place of the mouse's left leg there was a thick stump of wood, and it was this that thumped and tapped its way over the flagstones. A stifled chirp of understanding issued from Woodgett's mouth before he was able to stop himself, and at once the peg-legged mouse whirled around. "Crawl out of there, you scaly heathen! You'll not strike me down with your foul venom, you fork-tailed slime!" Rampaging into the nets, the attacker threw back his powerful arm to strike, but the blow never came. "By the green's beard! A field mouse, so it is!" Woodgett peered up at the figure from between his fingers and gave a thankful but shuddering nod. "Mulligan's the name, and that's how all folk hail me, plain and simple like." "How do, Mr. Mulligan? I be Woodgett Pipple, from Bethany Bank." "Glad to know you, matey. Let's jaw a while till I reach me ship." Woodgett looked up at the old sea mouse and wondered if he dared make the request which had hatched within him. Would it, could it, please, Mr. Mulligan, can come with you?" "I'd be honoured, matey. Let's you and me go find our ship and clamber aboard." As they made their way along the quayside, skulking in the dismal shadows behind them, a pair of watchful eyes narrowed, and a low hiss escaped into the darkness. Turning, the cloaked figure raised an arm, and instantly there came a cackling and a slobbering as a pack of 5 young rats bounded up, all inspired to murder by the bloodlust introduced into their craven hearts by the sinister creature. Pigsniff, Clunker, Mould-Toes, and Lice-Magnet were all brown rats, but it was Spots, their piebald leader, who asked, "Is it time, master? Is it the one you're after?" "I am certain. You may do what you will to the field mouse, yet before you slay the other, bring him to me and all that he bears." With a slap of their tails the rats leapt away, their murderous eyes fixed upon the unsuspecting mice a little distance ahead, and their throats burned to taste their succulent life-blood. A few moments later, Clunker's claws came sweeping round Woodget's neck, and his voice was choked into a gasping silence. Mulligan, however, was not so easily overcome. His stick smashed into Pigsniff's snout, and a shattered fang went clattering over the flags. "Accursed filth!" Mulligan raged as the others tore the pack from his shoulders. "Scum of the scale! You cannot have that! No! No, never!" The mouse lashed out as the bag was wrenched from him, and his protests were answered by a savage kick in the ribs. Spots hurtled forward and sank his teeth into Mulligan's shoulder. The squirming Woodget had been pulled and dragged behind a row of packing crates where Clunker bore down for the kill. Squealing loudly, the field mouse mustered all his strength and bounded away, nipping under Clunker's swiping grasp. "Help! Help!" he shrieked when he saw Mulligan's stricken form and Mould-Toes pouring over him. Spots, the piebald rat, was aware that some of the stall-holders were already staring in their direction, alerted by the field mouse's cries. The entire operation was going horribly wrong. In a moment, Woodget was caught again, and Spots drew out a glittering knife. "That's enough trouble from you," he said, pressing the blade against the field mouse's chest. Suddenly there came a ferocious roar, and before the rats knew what was happening, a maniac came barging into them, and Spot's knife went spinning through the air. All they saw was a blur of soft brown fur, a flash of red about the nightmare's neck, and a long wooden staff clasped in its paws, as it set about the gang like a vengeful whirlwind, and sent Mould-Toes flying into the harbour. While the unknown but courageous mouse dealt with Lice-Magnet, Mulligan threw off Clunker's faltering grasp and punched him on the chin. That was enough for Clunker. Squawking in fear, he raced off, leaving Spots and Licey to cope on their own. Spots snarled and wrapped his claws about Woodget's throat. "One move and this puny radish gets squeezed till his eyes pop out." "No, you don't!" Mulligan roared, bringing the piebald's own dagger slicing down. A tremendous scream echoed out over the sea as the rat's tail was hacked in two. Casting Woodget away from him, Spots fled along the quayside, screeching vilely. Breathless from fear, the field mouse stared across at the one who'd saved him and rushed forward to embrace him. "Thomas! You came after me! Oh, I'm glad you came, but I won't go back to Betley Bank." "Now, you got it all wrong. Listen, Woods, it ain't me, best loves. It's you." The field mouse looked at him in disbelief. "Honest? You're the one. I promised her I'd get you home, so we'd best set off." Mulligan looked at them keenly, and an anxious idea born of doubt and necessity formed in his mind. I doesn't think I can clamber aboard my ship without assistance." Woodget took a look at his wound. "Come on, you lay your arm on me, and Tom will take the other." So, with himself and Thomas supporting the wounded seafarer, they made their way to the ship and began to help him up the rope. A little distance away, the cloaked figure uttered a repugnant hiss and gazed down at the piebald rat who'd fallen in a swoon before him. Upon the creature's claws, 2 golden blades winked and flashed as it crouched down and drew them menacingly across Spot's throat. Spots shivered uncontrollably, and hot tears streamed down his hatchet face. The glittering blades pressed a fraction closer to the piebald's neck. Then, with a dismissive snarl, the cloaked figure rose. "Begone! Death shall find you in his own way. Yet slink away under the restraint of these ruinous words, and may they torment you until the end. For failing me, you shall never find rest. Always and forever will your mottled skin be in the service of another. Go now to that pitiless destiny. It will pursue you down the years until you despair of your very existence. Then alone shall you wish I had dispatched you now." So it was that Spots, or Morgan, as was his real name, vanished from that place, and the curse laid upon him was roused. Now, alone upon the gloom-laden quayside, the hooded figure came to a solemn conclusion. Carefully, the 2 golden blades were slipped from the creature's claws and stowed securely within a small travelling bag. Then the hood was thrown back and the dark green cloak cast aside. Once this too was safely put away, the figure stole towards the ship and quietly climbed aboard. "Not much further, mates," Mulligan cried. "Real grateful I am for this kindness." When they finally stepped aboard the Calliope, the trio were met by a burly mouse with dark brown fur and a lethal-looking sword fastened at his waist. "Name yourselves," called out Abel Rudaway, the boatswain, as the struggling trio wobbled and toiled towards him, and he uncovered a lantern to get a sharper glimpse of these indistinct arrivals. A look of recognition gleamed in his eyes when he saw Mulligan. "Whoa, cutting it fine, aren't you? These 2 are friends of mine, Master Woodget Pipple and Thomas Stubbs." Mr. Rudaway glanced at them but did not respond. Instead, he pointed at Mulligan's shoulder and jerked his head to one side. "You best get that wound seen to. There's a physician down below. Go and seek him out. He'll be by the cotton bales with the better sort." "Here we go, lads," Mulligan told his companions. "Just get me to the hold and I'll manage from there." They ventured down into the ship, descending a steep and narrow passage which led to the hold of the Calliope. There Thomas and Woodget came to a halt and stared around them in wonder. The hold was enormous. To their right, the curved hull of the ship reared into the high darkness above, whilst the far port side could not be seen at all. Filling the great space, enormous crates towered over them like square and wooden mountains. Yet at the foot of these lofty ranges, in the valleys and within the cramped channels and canyons, was a multitude of varied creatures, all preparing bunks for themselves and trying to make their allotted berths as comfortable as possible. "Don't you fret none," Mulligan whispered. "These motley cringers ain't going to harm you." As if to prove the point, he took a hobbling step forward and glared at a group of dishevelled and woeful-looking rats. When they saw Mulligan raise his stick, they threw their claws before their snouts and their bottom lips quivered. "Let's away from this place. The dregs are always to be found on the outskirts. A little further in, and we'll meet fairer company." And so Thomas and Woodget helped him to limp his way deeper into the hold. Genial mouse faces were now to be seen sitting in snug berths with small lanterns glimmering above their bunks. "This is more like it," Mulligan announced. "Here's where the decent ones are quartered." Thomas gazed around them and nodded smilingly at the sleepy faces who glanced in his direction. But a heaviness was stealing over his heart, and he was beginning to worry about the time. "Where do you think the physician'll be?" "Oh, he'll not be far. Let's head over there and I can get settled, and I'll just wait till he returns. However can an old salt like me begin to thank you 2 fine fellows? I know! I've a flask put away someplace." Well, we really ought to be heading home, Woodgett began. No, it's real offended I'll be if you don't accept what's offered. Is that your intent, to give me a second wound this night? Confronted by this, Thomas and Woodgett had no choice but to accept the mouse's invitation. Thomas took the flask from him and lifted it to his lips. Almost immediately he was coughing and spluttering. The rum was far stronger than the berry brew they'd drunk at Bethany Bank, and he leaned against the bale, wheezing and gasping. Mulligan laughed. "I'll bet that warms your innards! Ha!" By this time Thomas had given the flask to Woodgett, and now it was the field mouse's turn to squeak and choke. Suddenly the ship tilted, and, in horror, Thomas realized what had happened. "She's set sail! Quick, Woods, before it's too late!" Frantically the two mice pelted from the cotton bales, too filled with anguish and urgency to take their leave of Mulligan. Sitting upon the soft hessian, the seafarer murmured to himself, There warn't nothing else I could do. There's more at stake here than some paltry romance, so there is. The road ahead will be hard and deadly. All that matters is to keep the fragment from the enemy's grasp." Desperately, Thomas scrambled to the upper deck, where he darted to the side of the ship and stumbled to a halt. In a few moments Woodgett joined him, and they both stared out across the dark water in utter dismay. The Calliope had left the harbour and was already sailing over the open ocean. Thomas gazed at Woodgett and knew how crushed his little friend was. "You just remember this. It was me who got you into this fix, so I'll not be easy till I deliver you safe and sound to your bass. Rely on Thomas Stubbs, Master Pipple. He'll never let you down, ever." Yet, in the hold of the Calliope, amidst the weary travellers and masquerading as one of their number, something evil was stalking. With watchful eyes and a black soul consumed with malice, the figure passed between bunks and berths, seeking out the one who'd thwarted his followers upon the quayside, and was now, no doubt, congratulating himself on his escape. But from the nightmare which prowled stealthily through that meandering, unsuspecting warren, there could be no deliverance. The time of the usurping green was nearly over, and the ancient shadows were already lying heavy over eastern shores. The terror of the dark time was rising. That which had been cast out in ages past was nigh. Unaware of the black fate which lay ahead, the Calliope journeyed on towards the awaiting doom. In the days that followed, Thomas saw little more of the watery world outside, for that first night, when his wonder at the beauty surrounding him had waned, he'd begun to feel queasy. "It's the seasickness, all right," a hearty Mulligan had told Woodgett. "A fine mariner he's proving to be." The field mouse had stayed by his friend's side for all of the first day, but by the evening he'd grown restless, and when Thomas had fallen into an uncomfortable slumber, he decided to investigate the hold a little more. Squinting into the darkness that obscured the entrance to one of the narrow ravines, and among the shadows a little distance away, he thought he could just make out the tall silhouette of a rat. A cracked voice flowed from the darkness. "Off to see that peg-legged chum of yourn? I'd be careful if I were you, Titch. I done heard odd tales about that one." With that, the rat shape stirred and took several steps closer to the opening. Why you lurking and hiding and creeping up on folk?" Woodgett demanded in a frail voice. "Japhet wanders where he will, and won't be quartered nor show no boundary. Be warned, Titch. A fellow like you don't have the first notion about the wild world. There's terrors out there to wither your tail and staunch the blood in your veins." Even as he spoke, there came the sound of footsteps, and the shadowy rat turned about in the cramped passage and scooted off into the distance, vanishing into the dark. Shuffling down the alleyway, With his sloping shoulders bowed and his slightly flat-shaped head slowly shaking from side to side, there now came the figure of a young mouse, his large head bobbing upon his thin neck. "Who's that?" he gasped, as Woodget let out a gurgle of laughter. I begging your pardon," Woodget declared. "I was just so relieved you weren't no one of them awful rats." The grey mouse regarded him for a moment and then grinned stupidly. "I done seed nothing, and I ain't no ratty Bigfoot snotty-nosed scabtail." Woodget smiled and introduced himself, and the mouse shook his head, causing his ears to flap as he did so. "My name's Dimlin, though Auntie always calls me Dimmy. Ha! Auntie said I weren't no good at anything, Dimmy like with Stunderhead. Course, she didn't think I'd ever find the harbour, let alone get on a boaty. Just wait till I sees her face when I come back with something rare of foreign and put on a table, push dust collecting whatnot. A statue of an effie-lump I'm hoping for. She'd fair flip for that, she would. Ha!" Woodget laughed at his idiotic talk. "Well, I'm pleased to have met you anyways. I was just off to find my friend Mr. Mulligan. I'd be glad of the company, and I'm sure he'd be glad to meet you if you're willing to join me." Dimlin consented and trudged happily alongside the field mouse. Suddenly, two mouse children came running onto the main thoroughfare from a dark opening between the huge packing crates, their faces drawn and their merry voices changed to whimpers of dread. But then the object of the youngsters' fear stepped into the lantern light, and a thrilled, expectant murmur rippled through the gathered families. "Oh, a travelling magician. Will he perform for us, do you think?" "Hearken to me, voyagers all," the mysterious stranger cried. "Know now that Simoon, wanderer of the ancient pathways, farseer, chanter of spellcraft, diviner of fortunes, treader of the forgotten track, and guardian of the old rituals, is amongst you." At once there was a bang and a flash of yellow flame, which instantly turned into a cloud of thick blue smoke, shot through with fizzing orange sparks, and then the magician was nowhere to be seen. Dimlin let out a whoop of delight. Woodget did not like to tell his new-found friend that Simoon had simply ducked back into the dark opening under cover of the smoke screen. "Come on! Mulligan ain't far off now." When they reached him, the old seafarer was sitting with his wooden leg resting upon his pack. Sitting beside him was Abel Rudaway, and it was obvious that he too had been drinking. Woodget grinned and introduced Mulligan to Dimlin. "Sure, I'm pleased to meet you. Now, let me present an old mate of mine to you." He jabbed Mr. Rudaway in the ribs with his elbow, and the mouse jerked his head up, startled. Turning back to Woodget, Mulligan said, "Tell me, how's that chum of yours? Has the sickness passed?" The field mouse shook his head. "Oh, that it hasn't. I'd have come sooner to ask for help, but I met a rat on the way, and he weren't no cringer, more like them that attacked us." Mulligan's face changed immediately. "What did he look like?" "Oh, I couldn't tell. He kept in the shadows." Shifting round, Mulligan shook the boatswain by the shoulders. "How many other passengers joined before the ship left harbour?" Let's see. Was it one or two?" Mulligan grasped him tighter than ever. "Your book. You'll have entered all their names in there. Where is it?" Woodget was alarmed and almost frightened by Mulligan's behaviour, and he recalled the panic he'd first heard in his voice upon the quayside. Staggering to his feet, the boatswain saluted them with his sword. "I'll go fetch me register and bring it down." An awkward silence followed his departure, with Mulligan staring into space. Unexpected hazards had waylaid his quest far too early, and in his heart he knew he could no longer go on alone. He would have to share the terrible burden or be driven insane. The fate of the world was in his keeping, and if he stumbled, then endless night would fall. Abel Rudaway stumbled to the upper deck and reeled backwards as the keen salt air gusted into his lungs. For many minutes he stayed there, waiting for his head to clear, listening to the water washing against the ship as it ploughed unerringly on. "Oh, I better get that passenger list for the Rogue," he said, striding a little more surely now that the rum-induced haze about his brain was lifting. In a trice he disappeared within, down to a well-ordered though humble space which served as his quarters. Once inside, Mr. Rudaway fumbled in the darkness, reaching out for the tinder-box he always left just below the entrance. When he found it, a spark crackled and flared, and the ember of a candlewick kindled into flame. Mulligan, he muttered, searching the entries in his notebook. Ah, Mulligan and 2 comrades boarded, being a Master Woodgett Pipple and Master Thomas Stubbs. Holding the book a little closer to the candle flame, he peered at the names entered beneath and fingered his beard. There were 3 more then, though that last one's a surprise. How could I have forgotten? Upon the deck, the eyes that watched the boatswain emerge narrowed, and a soft, sibilant whisper flowed from tight lips. "I was seeking you." Before him, the sinister shape gave a flick of its tail, and Mr. Rudaway choked back a cry when he beheld a hideous sight before his eyes. "Green Savers! Then it's true! The story's from the East!" The watcher laughed. "Assuredly so. The scale do exist, but that knowledge shall die with you." With that, the creature leapt forward, and the 2 golden blades upon his claws raked twin lines across the boatswain's cheek. "Already you have lost," the attacker crowed, as the boatswain drew his sword and fought the blades valiantly. "Did you not know that our claws are dipped in venom? Can you not feel the dark fires raging in your veins? Mr. Rudaway balked at these words, for he could feel a blistering heat scorch his cheek, and his teeth ground together as every nerve began to scream. "Help! Help!" But he had thought to cry too late, for in his throat black blood was boiling, and the venom burned down into his rasping lungs. With a callous leer, his attacker came forward, and Mr. Rudaway felt the notebook wrenched from his belt. Then, shaking with pleasure, the foul creature perched him upon the ship's rail and allowed him to teeter there for a moment. Sniggering, he placed the glittering knives at the boatswain's throat and plunged them deep into his bubbling flesh. Abel Rudaway's torment was over, and with a violent shove his killer cast the gored and butchered body out over the side. None shall come within a league of him. The bitter juice of the serpent now claims those fathoms. All hail him, all abase themselves before him, for he will come amongst us once more. And so the evil creature left that place, and carefully removed the knives from his claws, before returning to the hold, where his true victim sat and waited in vain for Mr. Rudaway's return. Never had the ship been so thoroughly searched. Every possible niche was pried and poked into, but eventually, after much exhaustive labouring, the disturbing conclusion had to be drawn. Abel Rudaway was no longer on board. Speculation crackled through the hold like a fever. The troubled imaginations of the passengers invented 100 different reasons for the boatswain's disappearance, and each of them was darker and more frightening than the last. Finally, the captain was forced to quell the rising panic by declaring that whilst in a stupefied state, Abel Rudaway had no doubt stumbled and fallen into the sea. Mulligan knew that the skipper could not be more wrong, and now he was certain that his enemies had followed him. The air in the hold became charged with the bristling tension, and when Thomas finally crawled out from his bunk, the discord almost took his breath away. He felt as though he'd been asleep for a fortnight, but it had been a disturbed slumber, and one that brought no rest. Now his limbs were weak, and he patted his shrunken, growling stomach ruefully. "'Tis a woeful time, Tom," Woodgett said. "You won't know the place now. It's changed so much, folks are all on edge. I doesn't like it." So, how's Mulligan? What's he been up to?" Woodgett shrugged, but said nothing. "What's the matter?" The field mouse twisted his mouth to the side, and Thomas recognized that expression as the sign which meant his friend was troubled and thinking deeply. "There's somewhat not right there, Tom. He's so edgy and glaring, I doesn't know which way his mood'll swing from one moment to another. And always he keeps his bag with him. Poor, must be precious whatever's in there." Thomas grimaced. "I'll wager it's 3 more flasks of rum. Come on, you can take me to meet this Dimmy you've been telling me about." With his friend at his side once more, Woodgett felt happier than he had done since leaving the harbour, and chatted freely of the characters he and Dimlin had met in the past few days. Out to the main thoroughfare their steps took them, and again Thomas was astonished to view the change that had stricken the other passengers. The families were huddled in groups, and the eyes that turned to him were no longer friendly but seemed to fix upon him with suspicion. In silence they pressed on, and Woodgett quickened his pace when they came near to the cotton bales, slowing only when they were left far behind. "This is where Dimmy lives," he chirped when they finally reached a dingy, neglected corner at the rear of the hold, where heaps of wool sacks rose to form a ragged and shadowy mass. Situated this close to the ship's engines, a rhythmic pulse throbbed through the air like the beating of an enormous heart. Ho there!" cried the voice of Dimlon. Hello, Woody. What are we doing today, then? Clumsily, the pale grey mouse sped down the spongy sacking slopes with his arms out wide. And your friend Tommy's all better. Real happy I am to see you on your legs this merry morning." Thomas returned the greeting, and soon all 3 mice were talking as if they'd known each other all their lives. "Well, I think it's time we called on this magician of yours," Thomas suggested. "Oh, Simoon!" Dimlon exclaimed. "Oh, yes, we was waiting to you a while again, Tom. What do you think we should go visit, seek him out? But I ain't sure. Real eyes popping started crackler he looked. Ha! Down a labyrinth of narrow alleyways and ravines, beyond the populated areas of the ship, Simoon the prophet had fashioned suitable quarters for himself. Across a cramped space, 2 poles were wedged into the towering wooden sides at varying angles, and over them was draped a length of red cloth, faded in parts by bleaching desert suns to a soft peach. Behind his new friends, Dimlin peered over the top of the field mouse's head, his long neck swaying from side to side as he gawped idiotically at a tunnel of glimmering golden light produced by 6 tiny brass lanterns. "Whoa! Fairy grotto pisky delving! Ha!" "Come on," Thomas urged. "Let's go a bit further." Woodgett nodded breathlessly, but Dimlin was not certain. "Oh, don't disturb him in there," he whined. Thomas smiled at him. "All right, we won't disturb him what lives in that there tent, but I'd like to get a little bit closer just to peek at what's inside." "Will you dawdle out there all day?" Thomas leapt back, and Dimlin let out a woeful shriek. The voice had come from inside the tent, and he clutched at Woodgett's paw in terror. "Wah! He knows we're here! Let's go, let's go, let's go!" With that, the pale grey mouse turned tail and scampered back round the corner. "Woodgett Pipple," commanded the strange voice, "let the fool go. I desire no speech with him. Come, join me." The 2 mice hesitated for a moment, and then stepped into the glimmering tunnel. Within the tent, a flame sputtered into life. At its side, within a metal bowl, a cone of incense was burning, and its scented fumes had collected into a dense pall of obscuring blue smoke. Staring at this ever-moving, writhing cloud, Thomas thought he could just discern a squat figure in its choking depths. "Forgive this fog and vapour. I find the profound fumes sharpen and hone the blades of my thought, though maybe it's not to your liking." The nebulous creature clapped its paws together, and, like a crashing wave, the mists fell away, dissipating from the shadowy corner and scudding out through the entrance. Thomas blinked. Woodgett rubbed his eyes, and the prophet smiled to see their bewildered expressions. His head was small and covered in the same sandy fur as his puny arms, but the first feature which struck them about Simoon was the creature's eyes. Never had they seen any so large or dark. Below the slightly pointed nose a small mouth was still curled into a smile, and upon the chin bristled a great many white, wiry whiskers. What? Who are you?" Woodgett managed to utter. "A jerboa, am I? Hopper of the parched baking wastes, burrower of the sky-shifting hills, he who shuns the fiery day. But you did not come here to learn of my histories. You have come to ask that which only I can know. Did you not come hither to learn what I can see of your futures? Is this not the truth?" Thomas leaned forward. "Can you really do that?" "Well, couldn't you just tell us a tale or two?" Woodgett interrupted. "Oh, yes," agreed Thomas. "What about a yarn from out of the east? I've always wanted to travel there." The prophet turned to stare at the incense burner, and his eyes became fixed upon the constantly winding smoke. "Then shall I speak of Sruth Scaroffion, he whom others call Gorskarigern, the coiled one, the serpent, Sarpedon. Others cursed him, the dark despoiler. All titles are just, yet none do justice. Words describe him not, nor laments bewail his cruelty, but a devil he was, clad in the form of a serpent, the like of which had never been equalled. Devoted to him were his followers, and his cruel dominion spread, his savage priests gathering more into his dark service. Only the newborn did they accept into the black following. The expression faded from the Jerboa's face, and his murmuring voice was barely audible above the soft sizzling of the incense and the faint muffled sound of the waves sluicing around the outside of the ship. Know now the signs of the scale, for when a newborn is taken into the dark fold, its tail is butchered, slit, and hewn into a mockery of their monstrous lord's forked tongue. Beware any so mutilated. Shun them and fear them. Only an adept, or one of higher rank, may cleave the halves of its tail together to pass unmarked amongst his enemies. "Oh, well, what happened to the Dark Despoiler?" Woodgett asked. "Was he overthrown?" He was indeed. Long the two opposing forces grappled, the followers of the serpent against those who could summon the powers of the green. Spell upon spell, might against might, enchantment crashed into devilry, and all around the ground quaked, ripping open huge pits which boiled with liquid flame. Then did Scarophion's strength break, and the forces of good prevailed. The dark despoiler fell, and the land was made clean once more. Simoon's voice trailed off, and he took from a hidden pocket in his robe a pack of colourfully illustrated cards, which he held out for Thomas to touch. "Now shall your fate be revealed," he intoned, placing 5 of them face upwards on the cloth. "A maiden has driven you hither, or rather your envious coveting of her. You have commenced your journey poorly, Master Stubbs. May you end it better. Simoon moved his gaze to the second card. Danger is close to you, and your way is littered with peril. Thomas frowned. He didn't like the sound of it so far, but the third card showed an illustration of the sun, and he hoped that that would signify something cheerier. A charmed life is yours, Simoon grunted. But when he studied the fourth picture, he shook his head gravely. Here is the sign of the rolling waters. Yet see how they are tormented by storm and tempest. There was only one card left. It depicted a broken anchor, and Simoon took several minutes pondering its meaning. Your life is with the sea, but no joy shall you find in it. A great weight shall ever drag you down. Thomas gazed at the cards uneasily, then tried to shrug off the prophet's forbidding words. "Well, you had me going for a little while there, you did," he said. The large black eyes of the Jerboa gleamed at him. Then the lids closed over them, and the mittened paws collected up the cards. "And what of you, field mouse? Do you desire to lift the veil and spy upon your destiny?" Woodgett bit his lip as his trembling paw stretched out to take one of the cards fanned out before him. "No, Wudge," Thomas said impulsively. "Let it be, please." The field mouse wavered, but his paw flashed out. Deftly, Simoon flipped the pack around and took out the card that the field mouse had chosen. "Here is a picture of a pretty damsel. Love is her name, and under her sovereignty does your life lie, Master Pipple." "Oh, that's Bess!" Woodgett grinned. "Come on, Wudge," Thomas growled. "Time we went." Behind the obscuring fumes once more, Simoon placed the cards down upon the cloth and gazed at the picture of love he'd shown to Woodgett. Then he took from the bottom of the pile the one he'd hidden, the one the field mouse had really chosen. And he shuddered. Hastily, as though the image frightened him, Simoon threw the card down and shrank further into the mist. Upon the cloth lay the picture of a serpent. Flames dripped from its jaws, and along its twisting back were painted 9 bright stars. A little distance from the lonely alleyway, where Simoon's tent was entwined with faint blue wisps of smoke, Thomas and Woodgett discovered Dimlin curled up in a corner and sniffing forlornly. "Oh, it's creepy dark down here. Dimmy was too afeard to go far on his own-some." Thomas helped the pale grey mouse to his feet and brushed the dust from his fur. "Why, just some travelling conjurer, nothing for you to be afraid of." Was Simone really a hoodwinking, swindly bamboozler, huh?" Woodgett cocked his head to one side. "'Tain't for the likes of me to say. I can tell you this, though. He do rattle out a good old tale." When the maze of passageways was finally left behind them, and at last they reached the cotton bales, there, hobbling towards them with his stick in his strong paw and his pack slung over one shoulder, was Mulligan. "Where have you been stowing yourself?" he cried, clapping Woodgett on the back, nearly sending him flying. Has Master Bosun been found?" Dimlin cried. Is he safe? What news?" Mulligan stared at the foolish mouse, then cleared his throat. "No, he's still lost, but his going won't be unmarked. So I invite you 3 to a final drink to an old friend up on deck with the sea around us and the breeze in our whiskers. What say ye?" Dimlin's whiskers drooped sadly. "Oh, I doesn't want to go on deck. I might fall in and be dunked down deep." "That'll not happen with me to gouge you. Now let's to the upper deck and give old Abel a fitting send-off." Onto the deck the 4 mice came, and all filled their lungs with the keen salt air. This was the first time since the Calliope had left the harbour that they'd ventured out of the hold, and the sight of the open sea in the daylight was a miraculous, almost worshipful vision to behold. "It's incredible," said Thomas. "Like a wide, flat country of dancing light. Mulligan and Dimlin were sitting by the deck rail and already taking their third swig when Thomas and Woodgett joined them. A grin more idiotic than was usual had slid onto Dimlin's face, and he was giggling gleefully. But that's Licky Tunsil gargling fruit juice! Ha! Mulligan raised the flask to the surrounding sea. Here's to you, Abel. May the deeps of Fiddler's Green keep you. For nearly an hour they sat there, at times talking gravely, but mostly the speech was merry. Of adventures in remote climes the peg-leg regaled their attentive ears, from the coasts of Spain to the Western Indies, proudly displaying the faded scars which lay beneath his brindled fur as testimonial of the skirmishes that had found him. Have any of you ever clapped eyes on the land of Greenwich? A haven for the weary. Almost I forgot me cares when I was last in its border, so I did. This very winter I stood before that throne of oak and endured the star-wife's withering scorn. Then he coughed and blustered about the fine weather as if he had not meant to mention that he'd been there at all. Woodgett lay on his back with his paws behind his head and his eyes gazing up at the deepening blue sky. A comforting hum pulsed in his ears and lulled him into a delicious sleep, where a fair and haunting voice sang in the far-off distance. Suddenly he snapped his heavy eyelids open, for surely that voice was no figment of his drowsy brain, and for an instant it seemed that it was real and called to him. "Oh, dreaming you are, Pepple," he told himself. Then, when he'd given up all hope of ever catching that blessed sound again, there it was, drifting on the warm evening breeze. Now the divine music filled the air, and those who listened prayed that it would never cease. "Look!" Woodgett hissed. "Over there!" His friends squinted through the glare of the shimmering water, and then they saw a dark speck bobbing upon the burnished waves. "Hello there!" Woodgett called. At once the singing stopped, and the speck sank below the surface. "That were a piece of driftwood," Mulligan said, shaking himself out of the spell the beguiling song had woven round him. "And that was no voice, it was just the wind. I'm thinking it's time to get below." Woodgett continued to stare out at the empty waves. "Not yet. I'd like to stay a little while." "Well, I'm definitely stopping," Thomas said. "I wants to get a good look at who's singing." "Now, what about you, Dimmy?" Mulligan asked. "Would you care to keep an old rascal company?" Dimlin glanced at the others. All righty, I'll go with you. His eyes gleamed in the gloom, and all traces of his former sleepiness appeared to have left him. With a smile on his face, he followed Mulligan into the blackness, and silently he fumbled with the buckle of his satchel. Ahead of them there was a shuffling sound, and from the complete darkness ahead loomed the imposing figure of a tall rat. "Who are you?" Mulligan demanded, gripping his stick and brandishing it threateningly. Maybe you've heard my name already," the rat's cracked voice uttered. "I done told your other little chum." "Jaffet," Mulligan murmured, and he stared nervously at the creature's tail, but it was too dark in there to be certain. "What's in the bag, Pegleg? Shall we open it and take a peep? Let me lay my curiosity aside." "Keep back, you vermin!" Mulligan roared, his temper flaring. Breathing hard and quivering with fury, the Irish mouse drew Dimlin closer and placed his paw upon the pale grey mouse's shoulder. "Come, Dimmy, to the hold!" Quickly the two mice gained the bottom of the sloping way, and the hold opened up before them. Alone in the passage, Joffert drew his claws thoughtfully over his snout. and slipped silently after them. "Come on, Wudge," Thomas called. Several feet above the waterline he'd espied a narrow ledge where two small mouse bottoms might just manage to perch for a while. So, with Wudgett's help, he'd thrown a rope over the side and proceeded to clamber down it. "Come on, Wudge. That's it. Paw over paw." Wudgett clutched the ledge for dear life. "Cool, Tom, what an awful seat this is. We could tumble in the drink at any time." But before he'd finished speaking, there it was. The music which they'd imperilled their very lives to hear again suddenly began, and its sound was clear, like a bell of crystal ringing over a barren, tuneless land. "Thomas," Wudgett whispered, "look, d'ye see?" A little distance from the ship, rising from the radiant and gentle waves, the top of a head appeared. Golden was the colour of the hair, which hung in long trailing tresses. Delicate shells of many lustrous colours were threaded into the glistening curls, and upon the creature's brow sat a circlet of small pearls. Like a mouse maiden she appeared, yet unlike any their eyes had ever looked upon. Like two shapely fins were her ears, and their spine-webbed elegance served only to enhance her grace and beauty in Thomas's eyes. Captivated by the vision in the distance, Thomas let out a yearning sigh, but the sound was far louder than he ever intended, and was carried far across the water. At once the lovely creature looked up and stared angrily over to the calliope, and an instant later she was gone, vanished beneath the sea. "Oh, she'm gone, Tom," Wudgett muttered sorrowfully. "But what manner of folk were she? 'Tweren't natural." Suddenly a voice laughed at them nearby. "What strangeness is this? A fine pair of Tritons, I deem. Halia did not know there was an audience for her song." "Oh, I'm sorry," Thomas said hastily. "I just wanted to hear your music a while longer." "Then stay a moment longer, Master Triton." The golden-haired maiden clapped her paws together 3 times and called out 6 names. "Dias, Enalus, Metanaira, Myrta, Carmanor, Zena, come, look on what I found!" To Thomas and Wudgett's astonishment, 5 other faces rose from the water. The tresses of one shone like silver, another was like burnished copper, 2 others were livid green, and the 5th was as white as the foaming waves. Mischievously, the maidens swam forward, their hair flowing wildly about them as their webbed paws reached up to clutch hold of Thomas's legs. "Help me ease this unwilling creature into the sea," Halia cried. "I would make a true Triton of him yet." The mouse merely chuckled and swung his legs out of their grasp. "Oh, alas, no, dear ladies. Once I tipped into the sea, that'd be the end of Thomas." "Thomas!" they cried, taking up the name and singing it with their silvery voices. "Thomas Triton, we now call you, a friend of the sea daughters." Thomas chortled, and Halia turned back to Wudgett. "And your name, Master Worm?" Wudgett." The maidens gurgled in their mirth. "Wudgett Worm, Wudgett Worm! Oh, see how he pouts!" Halia laughed. "The worm is as awkward as Zena of the sullen face. Zena, where are you? Come, let the sun shine upon that plain face of yours, if he can withstand such a drearsome sight." Then, from the rippling surface of the sea, rose Zena. Dark was her hair, black as a crow's wing, and no shell adorned it. Sleek and wet, it clung to her broad skull, hanging lank and heavy about her narrow shoulders. "Here, Master Worm," Halia cried, "I present Zena, who prefers skulking in stagnant grottos to singing in the sun." Wudgett's good nature hated this scornful teasing. "Now you leave her be," he snapped abruptly. "You're naught but vain and mean-hearted." The laughter died at once. Silently, Zena lifted her face, and her dark grey eyes gleamed at him gratefully. Then, with the faintest of smiles glimmering upon her face, she vanished back into the sea. "Oh, it would seem our sister has found the champion at last," Harlia eventually said with a frost in her voice. "Farewell on your voyages, Thomas Triton. Valiant deeds will you accomplish, and you shall win great renown." As the crimson fireball of the sun dipped low upon the rim of the sea, Harlia sank into the waves until only a vague shimmering mass of waving gold could be seen beneath the surface of the water. Night was falling, and already the first stars shone faintly in the darkening sky. As the Calliope voyaged beneath the deepening heavens, a shadow reared from the swirling waters of the ship's wake. With her leaden eyes gleaming, Zena watched the two tiny figures labour up the trailing rope. "Woodjet," she breathed, chanting the name as though it was something new and wondrous to her. "Woodjet." Then, purposefully, she began to swim after the great darkening shape of the Calliope, and was soon lost in the gathering shadows. The following morning, Thomas awoke late. Eventually he discovered Woodjet talking to Dimlin at one corner of the central road, and was surprised to see that they were both holding mops in their paws. One for you too, Tom. Mulligan suggested we ask the captain if we could earn our breakfast, seeing as though all our grub's run out, and so the three of us are the new swabs. For the rest of that day they were kept extremely busy clearing up the hold, and were rewarded by 3 square meals which they ate with the rest of the crew. By the evening they eagerly sought their bunks, and were asleep almost before they'd cast themselves down. Only one soul was still awake upon the Calliope. Within his tent, the hood of his cloak cast back over his head, Simoon sat before the incense burner, a pouch of soft leather clasped in his paw. From his quick tongue the rapid rhymes of a half-forgotten land poured, as into the pouch he delved, bringing out a fistful of herbs and powders which he cast at the burner. The air was filled with a dark, thickly swirling olive fog. Into this billowing mist Simoon stared as if it were a window looking upon a remote scene in the far distance. Bending his glance eastward, the Jerboa beheld the sundering waters tormented with storm. With terrible violence the tempest raged, and in its midst, sailing swiftly over the sea, was a dense, thunderous cloud, wreathed by countless forked and savage lightnings. Simoon's paws clenched into fists, and the knuckles blanched, as the tremendous effort to spur his will on took its toll. Through the obscuring storm he tore, rending aside the violent lashing screens to see what lay hidden within. Then he saw it, the hideous vessel concealed deep within the tempest's heart. A high golden prow rode the leaping waves, and Simoon shivered at its monstrous shape. Then the fiend upon the prow turned its malignant head and glared through the vast distance as if it were aware of him. "Enough!" Simoon wailed. "Arvit Nechwa Karavinda, Baraka Nechwa, begone, begone!" The Jerboa now snatched his staff, and from its rayed tip a green fire spluttered into life, and an arc of dazzling energy shot into the whirling mists. For an instant he heard the screeching of the heathen army and the vile curses of the hellish captain above the din of the storm, and then all was quiet. Sighing, Simoon shook his head. Far away, the forces of the scale are thundering over the sea, yet into the very skirts of their twisting wrath are we sailing. Verily a calamity approaches, and the morrow will be a day of doom. But Simoon the prophet must be ready when it strikes. The next day dawned bleak and grey, but through the choppy, buffeting waters the Calliope steadily smacked and scythed her way. Whilst the ship pitched and crashed upon the swollen, wind-whipped waves, Thomas, Woodgett, and Dimlin ran to and fro between the crates, trying to keep everyone calm. Then into the central thoroughfare came Simoon, and behind him he dragged a great bundle of possessions which he'd lashed together. Without a word to anyone, and not even appearing to notice their fearful faces, or indeed anything that was going on, Simoon began to tie his goods to the side of a large crate. Then he climbed to the summit and slipped his long, kangaroo-like feet under the straps. The assembled mouse families watched him in disbelief as the ship's movements became ever more erratic and unpredictable. "What's the wizard doing?" The children blubbed through their sobbing tears, but their parents didn't know the answer. Painfully the morning crawled by, and still the storm raged, with no sign of abating. In the hold an uneasy quiet had fallen. All were now too petrified to shriek or bewail their fate. Suddenly a wave, more violent than any they'd yet experienced, rammed into the ship, and like an insane seesaw the Calliope jerked and plunged as the wild, merciless waters possessed it utterly, and the passengers were shaken from port to starboard, then fore to aft, like jangling beads in an enormous rattle. "If you value your necks, hold on," Mulligan bawled, "or you'll be dashed to pieces. It's somersaults you'll be doing next." Soon the violent, brutal shaking began to reap a horrible harvest as tortured bodies were hurled across the hold. Never in all his young life had Woodgett been so frightened. Only Mulligan appeared unafraid, yet his face was terrible to look on, for it was set and grim, and as he raised his eyes to the ceiling he shouted his defiance to the green mouse, and in that hour his mood was as black and thunderous as the tempest itself. "This is not the end! It cannot go down to the deeps!" Then Woodgett noticed that Mulligan was only holding on with one fist. His free paw was tightly grasped about his precious bag, and the field mouse gaped in bewilderment. Even encompassed by all this death and horror, the peg-leg was still protecting whatever secret was hidden in that pack. By his side, Dimlin let out a shrill yell, and his fingers slipped from the tarpaulin he was holding. Squeaking, he tumbled down towards the mass of broken bodies, but just as he thought his life was over, a rough, tattooed paw flashed out, and Mulligan caught hold of him. "Get you back here, lad!" "When will it cease?" Thomas cried. And then, cutting through their dread and fear, a clear, resonant voice rang out above the din. "Hearken to me," Simoon cried. "Leave your moorings and head for the upper deck while there is yet time. The moment of doom is nigh. Let it not override you." Sliding his feet from under the straps around the crate, Simoon leapt to the floor, and with a small silver knife began cutting his unwieldy bundle of goods loose. "The fool's addled," Mulligan said. "Look at him now. He's climbing back on top of his baggage." Sure enough, Simoon hauled himself back to his former position, then folded his arms as if he were waiting for something. Further along the hold, Woodgett craned his neck to see what the Jerboa was up to, and he wondered what he should do. "Master Simoon," he cried, "what'll happen?" The prophet turned his head and bowed respectfully to the field mouse. "Make haste," he urged. "Gain the passage. Run to the upper airs. It is your only chance." Down the sloping passage there came the sound of running footsteps, and into the hold tore Captain Gabriel Hewer. Wretchedly he took in the awful spectacle of the squashed and broken dead, then called out at the top of his voice, "Abandon ship! Abandon ship! The squall's driving her towards the rocks!" Poor Woodgett was caught in the overpowering flow of the screaming, stampeding survivors, and was swept helplessly along, his scared little face bobbing up behind taller shoulders and upraised paws. "Fare you well, Master Pipple," Simoon breathed in a soft, sorrowful whisper. "Many are the ordeals that yet await you. May such blessings as are in mine power to grant go with you. Suddenly a tremendous crunch reverberated throughout the fabric of the calliope as the keel was driven over rock and reef. At once the sea came flooding in, the clamour of its spouting greed outmatched only by the screams of those still trapped in the hold. "Get you above!" Mulligan bawled at Thomas and Dimlin. Dimlin abruptly leapt into the opening as the crowd in front flowed forward. Mulligan lumbered after him, but Thomas hesitated, for there, down the central aisle, still sitting on top of his bundle of goods, was Simoon. "Simoon!" the mouse called. "Get over here now!" "Look to yourself, Master Stubbs. Fear not for Simoon, but turn if you can from the treacherous course which lies ahead of you." Thomas turned and fled into the passage, but his last glimpse of the Jerboa haunted him long after, as a wall of frothing brine came crashing in, and the prophet was swept into the far, murderous darkness. With his woolen hat pulled down about his ears, but unprotected from the needle-sharp biting rain, Woodgett clung desperately to the deck-rail as the torrential tides came blasting against the calliope's broken stern, and everyone around him howled in terror. No one knew what to do. The lifeboats were gone, for the official crew had abandoned the ship before she hit the rocks. "What'll we do?" screeched the mice. "We should have stayed below." Many of them tried to fight their way back to the passage, but collided with the overpowering surge of their fellow passengers, who were still issuing onto the deck, wailing that the waters were rising behind them. "Ah, come on, lads!" Mulligan bawled. "There's lifebelts enough for all. The ship can't help us now. She's done her best." "Stop right there!" bellowed a ferocious, commanding voice, and there was the captain, tearing up from the flooding passage with Mulligan and the others following close behind. "Youngest first," the captain commanded. "You'll have to remain here, Mulligan." The Irish mouse stared at him. I can't." "You don't understand. I must be spared. I have to." "You'll do as I say." Mulligan's face went pale, and his paw clenched his stick more firmly than ever as he snatched at a rope, and Dimlin squeezed in behind him. "Come on, Wudge," Thomas said. "There's just room enough for you and me." Together they reached for the lifebelt, but their paws never touched it. At that moment a mighty wave thundered across the broken deck, and with their terrified shrieks ringing in Mulligan's ears, both Thomas and Woodgett were dragged into the tempest-torn, froth-capped sea. Unable to swim, Woodgett's arms and legs kicked and flailed helplessly in the almighty churning sea, and as he squealed for help, the choking brine flooded into his mouth. Gradually, his panicky, frenetic splashings grew weaker, and more often now his head dipped below the destroying waves. It was too great a trial for one small field mouse who'd only ever waded in the stream near his home before boarding the Calliope. Now he was lost, engulfed in the fathomless expanse of the wide, beleaguering oceans, no more than a speck to be devoured and forgotten. Only one glimmer of joy glowed in the closing windows of his mind, an image of that summer's day when he'd gazed upon Bess, with the sunlight glinting in her chestnut hair and the scintillating reflections playing over her lovely face. Then, like a spent, wavering flame, the image was extinguished, and Woodgett's unconscious mind flitted into the snug, vanquishing void as his limp body twirled lifelessly down. Thomas flailed his arms about him, yelling the field mouse's name between his gasping breaths. Yet only the howling night answered, and his worst fears soared. Then, just as his thoughts became as clouded as the perilous night, a miraculous chance occurred. From the surrounding darkness, a barrel torn from the ship's hold came rolling into view. Sobbing in relief, Thomas managed to haul himself from the waves, then collapsed across the wooden sides, overcome by exhaustion, fear, and the horrible, searing loss of his dearest friend. "Woodget!" his whimpering voice cried. "Woodget!" As one emerging from a deep, troubled sleep, Mulligan stared about him, waiting for his jangled wits to collect and order themselves. He was sitting upon a bank of wet sand that sloped down to the water's edge, where the rippling waves meekly lapped the shore. His gaze fell upon the bag that had slipped from his shoulder and was now lying almost buried in the sand. "Me pack! Sure, it's born lucky you were, Mulligan. Ho, 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 ho!" Then, even as he was congratulating himself, his face darkened. What had happened to the others? Clumsily, the peg-leg picked himself up and scanned the sands. "Dimmy!" With his paws still clutched to the lifebelt, his legs and tail submerged in the shallow waters, and the satchel marked with the letter D twined about his body, lay Dimlin. Anxiously, Mulligan fell to his knees and pressed an ear to the mouse's chest. "By the Green's beard, the lad's alive!" Hastily, he hauled Dimlin from the water and laid him upon the sands. "You'll soon be spouting nonsense again, seems we've both got charmed lives." Grinning his lopsided smile, Mulligan thanked Providence, then slowly, as if some outside influence exerted its will upon him, he raised his eyes and gazed inland once more. "I know this place. Yonder are the White Mountains. By all that's wonderful, that cursed storm has washed me to the very foot of them. I'm on Crete. It swept me to the very spot I was headed for." Quickly the Irish mouse trudged up the sandbank, and soon the shore was left behind as he pushed through a gap in the hedge and limped his way to the meadow beyond. It had always been a beautiful haven of peace, one of the dwindling number of sites where the divine still flourished and was venerated. Nestling upon the mountain shoulders, an ancient temple had, through the ages, fallen into a stately decay, a graceful collection of eroded stones rearing from the verdant ground and pointing skyward. Many times had Mulligan returned to the temple during the course of his wayfaring life, and always the maidens who preserved its memory and tended the altar welcomed him, for he was the last of his line, heir to a part of the great burden which they too shared. But now, as his hobbling steps carried Mulligan through the blessed woods, he became aware of an acrid reek of burning and destruction. Billowing fumes coursed between the trees, and ahead he could see the angry flicker of flaming tongues. "No!" Mulligan gasped, as his eyes beheld the terrible devastation that had been visited upon the once idyllic place. "Not here!" Every one of the temple's weathered pillars had been hurled to the ground and set rolling down the sloping lawns, and behind it the sacred grove itself was ablaze. Mulligan let out a cry of disgust, and he reeled backwards as his tormented eyes beheld the grim spectacle at the centre of that once tranquil and hallowed place. There, around a large stone engulfed in a pool of congealing gore, lay many folk of the temple, but the white robes they'd worn were now stained crimson and slashed to shreds. "This is madness," he wept. "The madness of that foul, worming devil. The scale have been here, Those bloody clawed heathen murderers. What chance have I now? What chance have I? His voice drifted into silence, and he looked up sharply. Above the spitting crackle of the devouring flames, his ears caught the unmistakable sound of someone weeping. "Hoy there! Who is it?" Upon one of the toppled stones that had been cast down the hillside crouched a hunched, sobbing figure. To Mulligan's surprise, he saw it was a mouse maiden, and she was dressed in a robe of pure white. "Mulligan," she cried, her voice hoarse with weeping, "in the hour of my utmost sorrow you have come. The Green himself must have sent you to me." Mulligan limped forward, and into his outstretched arms the maiden cast herself. "I was the only one outside the temple when the attack happened. Neltimi is my name." Mulligan gave her paws an encouraging squeeze and asked, "How is it you survived this carnage?" "When the outriding gales of the tempest fell upon us, I was abroad in the forest. Never have I seen such a fury of nature. Then a vast shadow came sailing over the sea, like a black cloud it was, but travelling low over the water until it drove far onto the shore, and then the guys lifted, and I saw it, the glittering ship with its fearsome prow. It was the vessel of Scaroffion, and onto the sands leapt none other than the high priest himself." The maiden fixed her gaze upon the stricken face of the old seafarer at her side. "Why did the council not warn us of their strength? We were told the scale would not dare to assail us, and yet this hallowed place has proven to be no match for their barbaric might. The seventh fragment, which we have kept secret and guarded these many ages, has been reclaimed by the infernal legions of the Dark Despoiler." Neltimi shivered, then looked at Mulligan curiously. "And what of your errand? Did you bring it from the Star-Wife's realm?" "That I did," he answered, patting his bag. "Yet it is plain that this loathsome device cannot remain here now the shrine is destroyed. Only one course can I see now." "The city of Hara," Neltimi breathed. "Yes. Within its sculptured walls the final hope resides." "A long trek to India, so it is." Neltimi rose and laid a paw upon his cheek. "Then the last handmaiden of the temple bids you farewell." She managed a weak smile, then her forehead creased into a frown, and she stared fixedly at the shadowy woods nearby. In there, a movement. With his paw on his bag, Mulligan whirled round, and from the shade of the trees a thin, dark figure emerged. Neltimi stared at the peculiar stranger, and started when from his mouth she heard, "Mr. Mulligan? Wet and drenched and clogged and drippy nose, awful frightened I am. I doesn't like it. I wish I was back with Auntie." "You know this one?" Neltimi whispered to Mulligan. "Aye. Name's Dimmy." Dimlin sniffed, then glanced at the maiden before turning to stare at the fierce burning which still raged further up the hill. "Oh, what a beauticious big flickery spark whiz-bang blaze, and so hot! Why, even here my furs are steaming. Neltimi glared at the idiotic creature in dismay, then turned hastily to Mulligan. "Go now. Begin the long journey to the city of Hara." "I will," he answered, giving Dimlin a sharp prod with his finger. "And you're coming with me if you'll keep that prattling mouth of yours buttoned. I might yet be able to instill some sense into you." "Ah, such beneficence!" rang a sudden spiteful hiss that crackled with hatred and cut through the air like a razor. Neltimi clutched Mulligan's arm, and her eyes shone with fear as she looked upon the evil vision which now stood before her. What trick is this?" Mulligan stammered. Immersed in the diabolic glare of the leaping fires, the wide-eyed innocence now dismissed, and with a deriding, scornful sneer twisting his features, the mouse he'd known as Dimlin sniggered hideously. From his satchel he'd taken 2 curved, glittering blades, fixed them onto his claws, and was now waving them menacingly in front of their faces. "And who might you be?" murmured Mulligan faintly, although he knew only too well. "Darim Ruhar, loyal servant of the Black Sovereign." At that, he flicked his tail and brought it snaking round before him, dividing it in 2 until the halves curled backwards and the malformed shreds shook apart, twitching into a repulsive fork of flesh. His eyes burned with the golden light, and the dark pupils shriveled into narrow slits. "An adept!" cried Neltimi. "He's an adept of the scale." With his mutilated tail switching to and fro, Dachrem bared his teeth, and they saw that they'd grown into hideous yellow fangs. "Now you are mine, Mulligan." With a flash of gold, the claw reached out and seized Neltimi. Before Mulligan could do anything else, she was held fast in the treacherous mouse's grasp, his wiry arm crooked beneath her chin, glittering blades resting threateningly upon the fur. "Make no attempt to save her, for you cannot. The talons of Scaroffian are steeped in the vessels which house his black blood. One tiny snick of the flesh, and she is doomed to a torment greater than your pickled mind can grasp. Now, open that precious bag of yours, and give the fragment to me." "No, Mulligan," Neltimi gasped. "I am nothing. Run now, you must try." The adept of the dark despoiler squeezed her throat a fraction tighter. "Keep silent, or my talons may grow weary of your squeaking and snip into that lovely neck to carve out your windpipe." I don't," Mulligan cried. "Take what you want, just do her no harm." "The 9th fragment," Dachrem yelled. "Give it to me." Neltimi stared down at the terrible thing which Mulligan held, and even now was lifting up to give to him. "Take this chance I give you, Mulligan. Flee if you can." Gripping the 2 curved blades in her paws, she yanked them down towards her, and they plunged deep into her throat. Aghast at the sacrifice she'd made, Mulligan gaped down at her thrashing form as it convulsed and bucked in agony. Then he stared across at Dachrem, who was tensing himself, preparing to spring. "Scum!" the Irish mouse bawled, raising his fist and striking the creature's jaw with a resounding smash of knuckle and bone. Overwhelmed by hatred, Mulligan fumbled with the fastenings that held Dachrem's golden weapons in place, but in his anguish and trembling from the hideous screams that clamoured in his ears, Mulligan's fingers slipped. To his despair, the one-legged mouse's paw jerked along the base of the blade, and his thumb accidentally pressed against the razoring edge. In that awful instant, he knew he was finished. Suddenly the dying cries of Neltimi fell silent, and the Irish mouse stared over to her steaming body. "So the last of the 12 maidens passes, and soon I shall follow her." Wretchedly he stooped to snatch up the object he'd taken from his bag and removed from the many layers of wrapped cloth. Then with long lumbering strides Mulligan raced over the lawns and disappeared into the dim shade of the pine woods. In the brooding silence that followed, a groaning murmur disturbed the peace, and Dachrem opened one eye as gradually he slipped back into wakefulness. A brief pang of terror washed over him when he found that one of the blades had been removed from his claw, and he waited for the first searing agonies to commence. Yet no poison had invaded his lifeblood, and when he realized that, the merciless mouse marveled. "The fool," he whispered. "What lunacy of his run-drowned wits made him spare me?" Then from some distant reach of the obscuring trees there came a fearful shriek, as Mulligan felt the venom begin its grisly work, and Dachrem sprang up. Hooting with ghastly mirth, he set off in pursuit, fixing the knife back onto his claw. All was dark beneath the waves. Through the cavernous, rippling gloom, a solitary figure fell, turning slowly through the shrouding shade, like an autumn leaf lazily spinning from the tree. Down went Woodjet, his little body limp and silent. Then through the tideless waters Zena came, seventh daughter of the king under the sea, whose understanding surpassed the groping thoughts of earthborn races. Now, torn with anguish, she hurriedly reached the field mouse's side, and the light of her eyes dimmed when they beheld him. "Woodjet," she breathed, though no bubbles rose from her mouth. In mourning, she raised her webbed paw and caressed his furry cheek. Hastily, Zena touched Woodjet's temples with her delicate fingers and put forth the power that was in her. From her lips a wondrous, plaintive music began, and the haunting melody was full of enchantment and invocation. Suddenly the field mouse in her arms twitched, and his chest heaved as he jerked his head from side to side. A triumphant grin split Zena's face, and the music ceased. "From the brink have I brought thee, my little champion." Smiling wanly, she propelled him up through the darkness. Back to the churning pull of the upper tides they ascended, and Zena's gaze turned to the large floating cask and the figure that still clutched to it. "Woods! Take hold! You're safe! You're safe!" Shivering and retching in the fierce salt water, the field mouse lunged forward and felt Thomas's strong fists clench about his paws. Immersed in the waves, Zena turned away. She lingered too long, and a staggering fatigue now consumed her. Down to the darkness she descended, down to the restful halls of her father. Thomas looked up at the mountains that reared in the distance and wondered at the column of smoke which polluted the clean air, even as Mulligan had done several hours before. Rousing Woodjet, he waded onto the sands, and there they now stood, gazing about them curiously, lamenting the bodies of their drowned fellow passengers. Woodjet pulled his hat from his head in respect. "What do you think we should do, Tom?" "Well, there's nought we can do till we've laid these dead folk to rest. Why don't you start looking round for something we could use as a shovel? One great big grave will have to suffice. It's better than being gull bait." When nearly half an hour had passed, Woodjet had already commenced digging, and the number of drowned corpses which Thomas had brought over had grown to 17. The field mouse now watched Thomas's burly figure foraging amongst the wreckage, relieved that he did not have to perform such a grisly and unpleasant task. Then, before he returned to his own labours, Woodjet glanced at the glimmering horizon and rubbed his eyes. "Tom!" he cried, waving his arms in the air. "Tom! Tom!" Thomas stared at the shimmering sea and squinted at the dense cloud that sped over the waters. "What is it? 'Tain't no ordinary fog. Look how fast it's moving, and there ain't hardly a breeze." Woodjet's woeful voice cried in alarm. There's someone in there. I done heard it. Oars are dipping in the drink and pushing it on to the beat of a thumping drum, and there's voices too." "A ship? Why, it's not possible. Whatever it turns out to be, it don't seem clever to stay out here in the open for all and sundry to see. Let's you and me get off this beach and dart up into them meadows, perhaps even to the trees." Together the mice scurried over the shore and up the sloping bank as the mist flowed ever nearer, growing larger with every passing moment. From the pine woods there suddenly came a frightful scream that was shrill with agony and torment, and the hearts of both mice stopped as they listened. "Oh, what was that? God, Tom, what is this horrid place we've come to? I ain't going no further." Within the woods the screams continued, and with each hideous yell the horror of them intensified. Trembling, Woodgett looked over his shoulder to where the immense wall of mist obliterated the shore. "Tom, there's something moving in that fume down there. See, there's these figures wading out in the water." Now the meadow was engulfed by the ghastly cries, and Thomas knew that at any moment the maker of those grotesque screeches would burst upon them. "We're trapped, Woods. We can't go forward nor back." Behind him, down upon the sands, 36 stern-looking figures stepped from the sea. Tall and proud were these newcomers. At their sides they carried great spears with tapering burnished blades, adorned with scarlet beads and crimson tassels in imitation of the blood they'd skewered from their enemies. At the front of the armour-clad strangers, the tallest of them raised a gauntleted paw and charged up the bank towards the place where Thomas and Woodgett stood. But now Thomas recognized the figure that had come lumbering upon them. Mulligan! Through the pine woods, Mulligan had staggered before the venom that had entered him could execute its lethal work. Only a single thought burned fierce in his mind, outshining the pain that bit into his shoulder and crept across his chest. The fragment had to be taken as far from the ruined temple as possible. In his paw, the green and golden device slipped from his loosening fingers. Then, amidst his racking anguish, he heard a voice come hissing from the woods behind him. "No escape, Pegleg. Your office is over. Soon your eyes will boil. Give up. The contest is ended." Another bellowing scream issued from Mulligan's throat, but this time his voice was cracked and gurgling, for the venom was filling his lungs. Then, as he went crashing through the last swathe of growth that separated him from the shore, 2 blurred figures reared in front of him. "Mulligan! 'Tis us, Tom and Woodgett!" Hope soared in Mulligan's twitching heart as he reached up with his paw and pushed the loathsome treasure into Woodgett's astonished grasp. "Dad, take it to Hara, to the city of the Holy One. Swear to me. Swear!" Woodgett stared down, tears welling up in his eyes. I swears." A tremendous sigh galed from Mulligan's lips. There was still a chance to cheat the unholy fiend, and he bowed his head in gratitude. "Who's done this to you?" Thomas cried angrily. With his last strength, Mulligan pointed a shaking finger back over the meadow, but before he could utter the name, the venom claimed him. Emitting a strangled gasp, he slumped into the grass like a salted slug. Threads of oily smoke streamed from his ears, and the slime-filled sockets that had once housed his eyes crumbled and caved into the decaying skull. Dragging the back of his paw over his eyes, Woodgett turned away, then gazed at the thing the Irish mouse had entrusted to him. In his fingers was a large piece of curved jade, and under the morning sun the countless hues of rich, swirling green that spiraled within its ravishing depths appeared to move and pulse with an inner light all their own. "What do you reckon it is?" Woodgett asked. "Some kind of bowl, it looks like, but if so, then it's one fit for a king. You think Mulligan did steal it after all?" Before Thomas could answer, a cold, brutal voice resounded in their ears. "Take them!" Over the sands the armed warriors had come, following the sound of Mulligan's dying howls, and now there they stood, these strange creatures towering over the frightened mice, with no expression in their eyes save icy condemnation and bitter enmity. Their sharp, pointed heads were mostly hidden beneath ornate helmets, but their eyes glinted as fiercely as the polished silver armour which covered their menacing bulk. Even the long, powerful tails were covered in sections of jointed, beaten metal, although tufts of brindled brown fur could be glimpsed poking through the narrow, flexing gaps. Kicking and struggling, Thomas and Woodgett felt their paws being tied roughly behind their backs, and they were plucked from the ground and carried through the twisted shrubs onto the sandbank. "Make the ending swift," the leader barked, glancing across the meadow to the pine woods and beyond to where the now faint trails of smoke rose before the mountains. "There may be more of this detestable breed lying in ambush, Karim. Wield your sword." "Wait!" Thomas yelled, but it was no use. There came the ominous ring of metal as a gleaming, curved sword was drawn from its sheath, and into the air it sliced, tracing a brilliant arc of white light before it came scything down upon their necks. "Hold! Stay your stroke, Karim!" the leader bellowed. From the gnarled shrubs bounded the tallest of the armour-clad warriors, and in his steel gauntlet he grasped the glittering fragment of gold and jade that Mulligan had given to Woodgett. "How came this into your possession?" "'Tint mine," Thomas said gruffly. "'Twas given to my friend here." The leader snarled, and the other warriors murmured indignantly. "Permit me to kill the insolent whelp, Captain Triton," Karim demanded. "Thomas ain't lying," Woodgett piped up. "Master Mulligan done give that sparkler to me afore he died." Towering over them, the leader sharply drew his breath. "What know you of this Mulligan?" "Why, he were an Irish mouse," Woodgett began, "who liked a tot of rum now and then." And he had a wooden leg," Thomas added. "I believe you," the leader replied. But now his tone was gentler than before. Lifting his gauntleted paws, he carefully removed his plumed headgear and scratched his tiny ears. "Who are you?" Thomas asked. Chatan's eyes fixed upon him for an instant. "We are the enemy of he who was vanquished in the first pages of history, and are sworn to destroy all who still worship that base and faithless father of despair." Turning to his troops, he nodded and said, "Remove their bonds. My judgment tells me that here are no members of the evil brood." In a moment, the ropes that tied the mice's paws were cut, and they sat upon the sand, rubbing their aching wrists. "It is obvious to me that you have much to tell," Triton said, "but such tales must wait. It is clear that within this region there are still members of the Scale. Now we must march to the Temple of the 12 Maidens, and see in truth the terrible deeds that have been committed in that most hallowed place." The warriors lifted up their spears and shouted dreadful war cries, but before leading them away, Captain Triton instructed Karim to remain with Woodgett and Thomas until his return. "For your own safety," he assured them. Karim's eyes twinkled at them from inside the helmet. Then, with a sweep of his arms, the warrior removed his headgear, and they found themselves looking at a chubby face covered by dark red fur and a grinning mouth filled with large white teeth. "You have never seen a mongoose before?" "Mongoose?" Woodgett replied. "No, there bain't be no mongooses by Bethany Bank." Thomas glanced at the water's edge where the borders of the great island of fog still curved over the waves. "Is your ship in there?" Karim nodded. "But why do it lurk in that there fog?" "Always have the ships of Hara voyaged cloaked within vapours woven by our wise folk." "Well, Mulligan made me promise to take that golden thing to Hara," Woodgett confessed. "But I haven't even got it no more. Your captain still has it." Karim eyed him keenly. "Have no fear for that treasure. Chatangiri has no desire to steal it from you." Presently, Woodgett's acute hearing detected the return of Captain Chatan and the others. The sound of marching grew closer, and through the twisted hedge they came. Even though the plumed helmets still covered their heads, Karim could tell that their faces were drained, and horror shone in their dark eyes. From the rear of the company 2 mongooses came, holding some wriggling thing between them, and Woodgett clapped his paws in delight when he heard a familiar voice whimpering in woeful dismay. "Oh, Lordy, you've landed yourself in enough hot water now to boil an effie-lump. A right pickling fix bunkin' hole-pinching cleft stick this is, and no mistake, ha ha ha!" "Dimmy!" Thomas and Woodgett shouted with one voice. Even as the infernal Dachrem had crept closer to his enemies, preparing to pounce, his schemes were dashed as the armoured warriors came striding up the sandbank. Hastily he withdrew. The 2 halves of his forked tail joined together again, and his reptilian vision dimmed as his eyes changed back into Dimlin's innocent, heavy-lidded and docile features. Now, when the guards brought him before Captain Chatan, he was staring wildly in mock fear at the bright spears that surrounded him, and his head lolled feebly on his long neck. Woodgett rushed forward to fling his arms about the pale grey mouse's neck. "Oh, Dimmy, I didn't think I'd ever be cheered on this awful day, but I'm so glad to see you I could burst." Dachrem squeaked with feigned joy to see them, whilst at the same time he laughed inside, scorning their friendship. Those fools were his guarantee of safety from this proud, parading rabble. They would confirm his false identity and so place him beyond the suspicion of that haughty captain. Even while Woodgett hugged him, the desire to rip out his throat burned within his black heart, and he ached to drape himself in Thomas's entrails and lop off his snout. "What, he cried, gibbering with fake emotion. "And Tommy, too! It's a miracle! A blessings pinch me wakeful stunking wonder! Ha ha ha!" With his suspicious gaze trained upon Dachrem's expertly elated face, Captain Chatan spoke to Woodgett and Thomas. "We found him by the eaves of the wood, quivering like the spawn of the swamp frogs, but I do not trust him. There are ramparts of deceit behind his eyes. He knows more than he says." Thomas laughed and shook his head. "Ho! Why, there's nothing sinister about him." The mongoose stared at the prisoner a moment more, then gestured to the guards to release him. Then, lifting his paws, Captain Chatan held up Mulligan's precious fragment. "I do not need to tell you, Karim, that their high priest now possesses 7 of these baneful things. The peace long kept within the shrine of Virbius has been taken by those pagan curs." Later, upon the shore, 5 fires were lit, made from the shattered wreckage of the Calliope. Around the flickering flames, groups of warriors sat, and from their mist-enshrouded ship, the Chandi, provisions were fetched and cooked over the scorching heat. As Thomas told their story, Chatan and the other warriors listened attentively. Thus the entire journey from the skirmish upon the quayside right to the destruction of the Calliope was related. "A desperate road you have travelled," Chatan said eventually. "Yet the horrors you have witnessed are but glimpses of the great turmoil which confronts the present world. Whilst generations of your families have slept at peace in your remote, contented land, a stinking blight has crept over the other regions of the earth, and if it is not checked, one day it shall reach even your blissfully ignorant shores." "Are you really telling us that this snake god is still worshipped?" Thomas asked. "Even the Jerboa said it happened ages ago, and I didn't believe all that stuff he told us anyway." "Doubt is ever a ready weapon of evil," the mongoose declared to Thomas. "Know now the truth of Suruth Scaroffion, he whom we in Hara name Gorskarigem.
the coiled one. For many years now we have known that the heathen creed were multiplying and baptizing more newborn unto their evil cult. I fear that somewhere in some secret distant region a new temple now stands, and the rites of Goskarigem continue under the auspices of the cruel priest and priestess. Yet the worst horror I have still to tell. For now I speak of Mulligan's burden, and you too shall know of the dread that has plagued our thoughts for centuries. 9 segments of precious jade, carved and polished by dedicated claws, did Gorskarigem command to be brought before him. 9 priceless pieces in tribute to the 9 stars which burned in the heavens during the length of his blaspheming reign. Triton held up the fragment that Mulligan had kept hidden for so long, and everyone gazed at it, mesmerized yet repelled by its uncanny beauty. Profane arts wrought this, and the other 8 pieces are similarly devised. But it is written that when the 9 are brought together, the gold writhes with life, and the carven images reach out and join until the final shape of Gorskarigern's unhallowed design stands whole again. Dachrem pretended to look afraid, and in a quailing voice asked, "So, what is this shape? What does Mulligan's Baubley Sparkly Trinket become? What is it a part of?" A great green and golden egg, into which the foul spirit of Gorskarigern had meant to flee and be reborn into the miserable world, refreshed and seething with new burning life. Triton turned Mulligan's secret treasure over in his paws and frowned deeply. After the great battle in which Gorskarigern was overthrown, 8 pieces were entrusted into the care of the mighty kings and generals, and their armies bore them back to their cities in triumph. But they resolved that the 9th and largest piece of the egg should not remain in any lone place forever, and into the custody of one faithful to the green it was given. So, throughout the tireless ages, that is what the descendants of that virtuous bloodline have done, voyaging across the globe, visiting each holy shrine in turn, bearing this glittering thing of dread. "What, you said that the scale now have 7 of these bits," said Thomas in a wavering voice. "Are they really trying to find them all?" "They will not stop until the egg is reassembled and their demonic master is reborn." So where is the 8th piece?" Triton glanced at Karim before answering. "In the city of Hara." Thomas chewed his bottom lip. "Mulligan told us to go there." Lifting the golden fragment, Triton reached across and placed it in Woodget's cringing paws. "To you, the Irish nomad, entrusted this horrible legacy. May the green watch over you, for in the terrible time to come, I fear you will need his blessed protection." Woodget stared aghast at the gold-encrusted jade that sparkled in his grasp, whilst at his side Dachrem Ruhar smiled slyly to himself. Miserably, the mice emptied their bowls and stared dolefully into them, as if the solution to their troubles might be hidden there. Eventually, Thomas lifted his eyes and, turning to the captain, said, "If we have to go to this city of yours, then we'd best make a start. The sooner Woods and me get all this over and done with, the better." "Oh, and me," Dachrem pleaded. "Don't forget Dimmy. What he do stuck out here all on his lonesome? Let me come with you."
"Come then," Triton declared, rising to his feet. "Karim,
See that the fires are doused while I take our honoured guests to the Chandi."
Down the shore the captain strode, towards the waiting wall of mist, and with his gauntleted fingers he beckoned the 3 mice to follow. The fog bank was in the form of a great wide ring, and in its centre, sitting with immeasurable grace and symmetry upon the glimmering sea, was the most beautiful ship Woodgett could ever have imagined. 2 great emeralds, which burned with a fire like the unstoppable bursting might of spring, blazed in the eyes of the large and lifelike figurehead that was carved in the shape of the green mouse, and they shone brightly over the sea, guiding the Chandi through any waters, however fierce the weather or dark the night. Eventually they were all standing upon the Chandi's upper deck, where the rest of her crew were gathered in 2 regimented lines awaiting the return of their captain. All wore blue capes about their shoulders, and to Thomas and Woodgett's surprise they saw that as well as mongooses there was a complement of small long-tailed creatures with dark bars striping their fur, which they later discovered to be palm squirrels, whose agility in the rigging was unparalleled. Just then, Woodgett, who had been scowling to himself as his thoughts troubled him, asked, "How long will it take us before we reach your city, Captain?"
"My land is far from here, yet the Chandi can travel with great speed when the wind fills her sails. If we are fortunate, then the journey will not take much more than 15 or 16 days.
As long as that?" the field mouse murmured unhappily, and, clutching the fragment, he wandered to a corner of the deck that was covered with a canopy of white silk, and sat down upon a heap of cushions. "Whew, just think, Dimmy," Thomas murmured excitedly to the evil creature at his side. "We're setting off again to a land I've only heard of in old tales, one of the most mysterious and fabulous places there is. India." A distinct sneer formed upon Dachrem's face before he could stop himself. Then he gave a theatrical sigh and said, "Yes, but who knows what might happen between here and there." In the days that followed, the white and silver ship of Hara steered first towards Egypt and passed secretly through the great canal one early morning like a shred of dawn mist. At night the temperature dropped dramatically, and when the starlight glimmered cold and white upon the deck, the captain would join his guests and tell them stories of his city. Of Hara's history and legends they learned much, how it was founded many ages ago in the deeps of the Coiled One's reign by a wealthy warrior king who wished to build a stronghold in the mountains. But coming there, he beheld a vision of the green, and thereafter the monarch renounced his riches and power, and though his kin built the city around him, he remained on the mountain, communing with the green spirit until the day he died.
"Always in the years after," Triton continued, "has there been a holy one, a sadhu. They are the most blessed order, and the one who sits there now is counted amongst the wisest."
Woodgett smiled, then became thoughtful. "Do you think your Holy One will know what to do with Mulligan's fragment?"
Triton nodded. "If the sadhu does not, then no one can," he answered. "For he is the head of the Green Council, and all revere his words. They are few and seldom, yet never without value."
And so the days melted into weeks, and across the Arabian Sea the Chandi voyaged. Then a day dawned when there was much excitement, for through the enchanted mist a distant coast had been sighted, and their charts told them that there at last were the shores of their homeland. Thomas watched entranced as tall, spindly palm trees reared around them, and a sultry breeze fanned into his face. "Where's Dimmy?" he asked, turning to Woodgett. "He should see this. We're finally here." The field mouse looked back to the galley's stern and saw that their pale grey friend was slouched over the edge, seeming to stare glumly into the water that rippled in the Chandi's wake. "Why, I reckon he's feeling a mite homesick too," he murmured.
but not a single thought concerning the mythical life he'd invented for Dimlin occupied Dachrem's mind, as his baleful forces transfixed a large and repulsive sea snake churning through the ship's wake. "Hear me, little brother. Seek out the disciples of Scaroffion. Tell them that the time to assail the walls of Hara has come at last." The ugly head of the sea snake swayed from side to side as the instructions drove into its brain. Dachrem's strength of will was overwhelming, and with a jerk of his head he dismissed this newly devoted messenger. Into the waves the snake dipped its head, and with a furious thrash of its body sped quickly away. A horrific leer formed on Dachrem's face before the golden glow diminished in his eyes, and he became Dimlon again. Towards a narrow tributary the Chandi veered, but it was a grim, dreary-looking place, overhung with drooping branches that formed a tunnel of leaf and bough, and about which swarmed a choking cloud of mosquitoes. "I really doesn't like this," Widget uttered miserably. "Do not fear," Chatan said kindly. "It is not far." Then, abruptly, the overhanging boughs cleared, the forest became less dense, and as they followed the narrow river around a twisting bend, both Widget and Thomas let out gasps of wonder. Ancient was the city of Hara, one of the true hallowed places upon the earth, built in the deep shadows of the past to glorify the spirit of the green. And as the river curved around further, Thomas and Widget gazed up in dumbfounded amazement. There, hewn into the mountain and towering above the city, was an image similar to the one which stared out from the prow of the Chandi, but 100 times greater. Looming above the city, like a guarding sentinel to inspire hope in the hearts of its people and dread into its enemies, was a magnificent, almost worshipful portrait of the green mouse. Set in the middle of the immense sculptured forehead was a single green stone, whose livid light reached every corner of the city. Then the vision of the mountain was denied them, for the galley had rowed up to the city's walls, and barring their way was a huge gate of iron set into an enormous stone archway that spanned the entire width of the river. From a small window a furry face was peering down at them, holding aloft a guttering candle. "Who comes to Harai the dead of night?" "'Tis I, Chatangiri, returned with the Chandi." "Speak the passwords," demanded the gate warden. What be happening?" Widget asked Karim. The portly mongoose grinned. "That was Fekal Katbal, a tree shrew. Most seriously does he take his duties, and so he ought to, for this is the only way to enter the city unless the walls are clambered and breached." But all further talk was hushed, for there came the sound of cogs and wheels being turned with the slow grating of rusted, scraping metal, followed by the rattling clink of heavy chains, and with a juddering motion, the iron bars of the gateway began to lift from the water. Up into the stone arch the barrier was hoisted, and beneath it the crew of the Chandi pulled on the silver-tipped oars, and the galley journeyed back to the place where she was first constructed. Joyous cries now rang through the steeply sloping streets as mothers met sons and the warrior husbands threw their arms about wives and children. But Thomas was looking around them at the unfamiliar buildings that towered over the steep and narrow street, admiring the detail of the carving. Nowhere was spared the skill of the sculptor. Statues of every living creature covered all available space, and in between them ran beguiling patterns or groupings of stone fruit and flowers. What do you think, Dimmy? Dachrem had often heard of the magnificence of this much-vaunted stronghold of his enemies, yet he never really believed half of it. A real Bobby Dazzly Spangly Dog's dinner this is. I'm sure to buy out his something real posh, shut up the neighbours here. But first, came Chatan's voice behind them, We must climb the 1,000 steps to the Holy One. I have no doubt that he will wish to speak with you this night."
So, up the sloping streets the captain led them, and gradually the mirthful sounds of the celebration they'd left behind grew fainter.
"Lordy!"
Dachrem squeaked as he stared up the stairs cut into the rock.
He's breathless already. Dimmy won't never make it up all them clamberers. He ain't Billy Goat and dangle-bearded button bottom. I'll stay here and wait till you come down."
"Very well," Triton said, but he turned to the others and asked them if they desired to rest for a moment.
"Oh, let's get on with it,"
answered Thomas. And so Triton, Thomas, and Woodget set off up the 1,000 steps, and as soon as they were out of sight behind a bank of solid rock, Dachrem whirled round and haired off back into the city, clutching his satchel and cackling to himself. It had been a long and strenuous climb, but eventually Thomas and Woodget found themselves at the summit. Above them the huge stone face of the green mouse towered upwards, and from the great open mouth where the beacon fire constantly crackled, there blazed a bright flickering light, which glinted in the mouse's fur and shone over the polished surface of Triton's armour.
"Come,"
the mongoose told them when he saw that they'd regained their strength.
"The Holy One will be waiting."
Up a well-worn, twisting path he then took the mice until the winding way turned a final corner and ended abruptly. Before them a richly embroidered curtain was draped across the rock. The mongoose hung his head respectfully, and with a glance to Thomas and Woodget that told them to follow him, he drew the ornate drapery aside and passed within. After him the mice trailed and found themselves inside a small, sparsely furnished chamber. Sitting in the middle of the bleak, secluded room, upon the ground, with his legs crossed and his paws placed lightly upon his knees in an attitude of meditation, was the Holy One. There he sat, he who was counted among the wisest of all living creatures, and who, above all others, purported to know the will and intent of the Green Spirit. The head of the Green Council was a loris, a small kind of lemur. Once the fur that covered his withered, mottled flesh might have been a pale brown, but now it was patchy and white, and made even more startling by the application of ashes. For over every part of his body the Holy One had rubbed and smeared the ash taken from the beacon fire, to purify him and bring him closer to the Green Spirit.
"Less than a moon has passed, Triton,"
his dry, whispering voice began, as his staring eyes scrutinized the mongoose captain.
"Hardly any time at all since you gainsaid my advice and took your ship to follow in the wake of Kalia, the golden ship of our enemies."
"Our quest was not in vain," Triton began. "If we had not departed, then never would we have discovered the companions of the Irish nomad." Before he could say any more, the frail loris held up both paws.
"I know all that has passed, more so than you do yourself. I may be old, Captain, my sinews might be shriveled, my bones dry and brittle, and when I walk I have need of a prop to support me. Yet that does not signify that my mind has mouldered also."
The aged loris now turned to the two mice and raised a paw to them in greeting.
"Hail to you, Master Stubbs, and to you, Master Pipple."
Thomas fidgeted with his neckerchief, feeling a trifle awkward, but the round eyes of the loris were trained upon Woodget.
"So, field mouse, unto you the Irish nomad entrusted the terrible burden.
No, do not bring out the fragment yet. Come, Triton, I have need of your arm." Across the room he went to where another tapestry was hung, and with his gnarled paws he dragged it aside. Beyond lay a dark stairway, and, still clinging on to Triton, the Holy One began to climb, closely followed by Thomas and Woodget. At the top of the stone steps was a wooden door, and when the Holy One pushed it, the door jutted open with as much creaking protest as his own arthritic joints. At once a sudden radiance flooded out into the dark stairway, and then the mice understood that they were now standing behind the green jewel they'd seen at the centre of the immense sculpture's forehead. Yet all eyes were drawn to the middle of the cavern, for there was a pool of gurgling water, and rearing like a glittering stalagmite from its centre was a plinth of solid crystal, carved with mysterious symbols and spells of abatement and restraint. Surmounting this was a silver dish, and Woodgett let out a little gasp when he beheld the object which stood upon it. Encased within a complex tracery of gold was an irregular-shaped piece of jade. "Yes," the Holy One declared, "here is the 8th fragment of the shell Gorskaragarn made in the deeps of time. Now, Master Pipple, bring out the legacy of our departed friend Mulligan." Into the repulsive glare the 9th fragment was lifted, and at once the unwholesome radiance was doubled as from the gilded jade in Woodgett's paws a second brilliance welled up. "Woods!" Thomas cried. "What is it?" In the horrible light, to his disbelief and revulsion, he could see that the intricate golden lattice-work was actually moving. Thomas grimaced and his skin crawled, but then he saw that upon the silver dish the other fragment was behaving exactly the same. Hastily the field mouse stuffed the object back into the bag. As he moved away from the pool, the 8th fragment ceased its frantic squirming, and the golden designs were motionless once more. Woodgett finished tying up the bag and bit his bottom lip thoughtfully. What is to become of Mulligan's fragment now?" The wizened Loris took a deep, rattling breath, and in a resolute voice announced, "The fragment shall abide here." "Here?" Triton repeated in disbelief. "What are you saying, Sado? I know the lore of Gorskaragarn as well as any." The Holy One held up his paw. "If but one of the fragments were to be destroyed, then the coiled one would forever be denied entry to this plane." Triton frowned. "I do not understand. The pieces are impervious to any violence. Are you suggesting that it's now possible to damage that which was made in the dark years?" "A little only am I permitted to impart. Did you not wonder why the Irish nomad was travelling when it was not the appointed time? His journey was at my instigation. There, at the temple in Crete, he was to have met with one who might have put an end to our anxieties." "Who is this one of whom you speak?" "I speak of the wanderer of the ancient pathways, Obe a pilgrim, Farseer, charter of spellcraft, mage, and prophet." "Simoon!" Woodgett declared delightedly. The Holy One nodded. Triton narrowed his eyes. "Sadhu, are you saying that Simoon is not drowned?" "The briny deeps will never claim that one. He is far from those waters now, and is at present bound for Singapore." "Then I must go to him," the mongoose exclaimed. "No. When Simoon has done what he intends, and only then, he will come to us. He needs no one to convey him hither. Certainly not you, Chatangiri." The Loris now shuffled forward and laid his paws upon Thomas's shoulders. "Master Stubbs, your role in this hazardous undertaking is finished, and you may depart for your home as soon as you are ready." Thomas looked at Woodgett uncertainly, and the Holy One knew what he was thinking. "The field mouse is also liberated from all obligations. Master Pipple,
The time has come for you to lay aside the burden Mulligan entrusted into your care. Place it here upon the floor, as far from the 8th fragment as is possible. It will be safe enough there." And so Thomas and Woodgett bade the withered creature farewell, and the Holy One was left alone in the glimmering room. "What we have done is for the good of all," he whispered to himself. "Even though you know the cost," came a sudden croaking voice from the doorway. "Did you hear what was said?" The figure nodded. "Triton is a valiant warrior," the Loris admitted sorrowfully. "If he so much as guessed the truth of our plans, then he would have attempted to put a stop to them." Into the domed chamber the figure came, and the glare of the 8th fragment glinted in the rat's beady black eyes. "The remaining 2 fragments are here waiting to be taken, and already the adept of the serpent, whom Triton and the 2 mice unwittingly brought with them, has paid a murderous visit to the gate warden. Fikal Katmal lies slain, and as I speak, Dachrem is operating the mechanism which raises the barrier from the river, leaving the harbour open to attack." The Loris's voice trailed off, and he closed his eyes as a bitter tear trickled down his wrinkled face and disappeared into the fine whiskers of his beard. "This night the forces of the scale will storm through the outer defences and assail the inner wall and find it undefended. Now help me to the steps. There is one final task I must complete." Reaching out his spindly paws, the ancient Loris clasped the other's strong arms, and Joffat the rat helped him to the doorway. On their return down the 1,000 steps, the mice and Triton had discovered Dachrem waiting for them, and in the gabbling guise of Dimlon, he quizzed them on all that had taken place. Passing back into the city streets, the mongoose had offered them the hospitality of his home, and they accepted gladly. After a bite of supper, they mulled over all that had occurred, but it was not long before Thomas began to nod, and so the guests were shown to their rooms. But Woodgett soon found that it was no use trying to get to sleep. His head was too stuffed with thoughts, and he tottered in vexation. "Well, maybe a little stroll and a breath or 3 of air will bring on the drowse," he decided, and so he slid from the sheets and padded noiselessly to the street outside. Just when he thought it was time to start retracing his steps, the sweet sound of running water came to his large ears, and he determined to press a little further to discover its source. Beneath an archway festooned with flowers he went, and to his delight found himself standing in a charming high-walled garden with a silver fountain. "You are far from your field, little master." Woodgett jumped and peered round to see who had spoken. "Who's there?" "Do you not know me?" came the silken reply, and there was a quality in that voice that reached deep inside Woodgett's soul and instilled a sublime feeling of awe. "What you be hiding for?" On such a night as this, even the greatest may hide and not be ashamed. For in the dark before the dawn terrible deeds shall be committed, and there is naught I can do to prevent them. Remember this, you wanderer. It is the journey itself that matters, and how you fare upon the road. Till the next time we meet, little master." Shrugging, Woodgett gave a cursory wave, stepped through the trees once more, and passed under the flower-covered archway. Behind him, a pair of gleaming green eyes shimmered between the leaves, and the garden suddenly burst into blossom before fading into nothingness. About the city the darkness deepened as storm clouds rolled across the stars, and from the depths of the jungle there began the solemn beating of many drums. Then the first rumbling of thunder boomed out beyond the city walls. The horizon flared white with the crackle of lightning. At once the field mouse stumbled to a halt and stared ahead in disbelief. For an instant, revealed under the jagged light, he thought he'd seen the frail and shambling figure of the Holy One, hobbling slowly down the stepped street which led to the great doors of Hara's inner defences. Then, just as quickly, that scene was engulfed in shadow, and the field mouse tottered at his own credulous senses. "Phew! Phew! You be a dreamin', Pipple!" A minute later, Woodgett entered the room Triton had given to him and Thomas, and after fumbling around in the gloom, then stubbing his toe on one of the bedposts, slipped back into bed. Across the landing he heard footsteps, followed by a gentle knocking upon their door. "Is all well with you, my friends?" Triton's voice asked. "Why, I done heard them drums a beating out yonder in the forest." At that the door opened and Captain Triton entered. "Drums? What do you speak of?" "Afore, when I went out for a stroll, there were a beating and banging of drums." "You ought to have woken me at once," Triton said crossly. "Let us pray no evil will come of this." Girding a sword about his waist, Captain Triton descended the stairs, then out into the city he went. With the thunder blasting in his ears, he barged to the entrance of the base of the tower and glared around the guard-room. There, slumped across the mess table, fallen from stools or slouched against the walls, were over a dozen mongoose sentries, and to his anger, each one was fast asleep. In nearly every paw there was a drained goblet, and upon the flagged floor were pools of spilt wine. With growing unease, Triton snatched up one of the goblets and sniffed it warily. Masked by the rich fruity scent, it was impossible to tell, but his instincts told him that this was no ordinary intoxication which had overwhelmed the guards. Breathless, he lunged through the trapdoor which led to the high platform at the top of the tower. All was lost in the obscuring torrent of rain that lashed from above, but with every livid electric flash the horrific scene was finally burned in upon his senses. Where the outer wall curved around, towards the crescent-shaped harbour, he beheld a great golden ship come sailing under the stone archway. "Kalia!" Triton croaked in horror. "The ship of the scale has come. What treachery is this?" Under the stone arch poured 1,000 disciples of the dark despoiler, with knives and daggers clenched in their teeth. Then, bringing up the rear, drifting like fallen ulcerous trees, came 50 monstrous crocodiles of the Periyar River, and their mighty tails pounded against the stonework of the archway as they streamed through the Haran outer defences. Through the guard-room where the sentries still slept soundly, Triton hurtled. "The scale are here! The scale are here! Awake, folk of Hara! The hour we have long dreaded is upon us! We must fight!" As he sped down the spouting, flooded streets, those who'd not partaken of the wine that night came scurrying out, with spears and bows in their trembling paws, and frantically they charged after him to defend their city. It was not far now, Triton thought, leaping through the deluged streets, with his saturated cloak flapping madly behind him, and his sword in his fist. He hared around the corner, but the sight which met his eyes caused his bounding stride to falter, and he slithered to a standstill. Soaked to the mottled skin, leaning upon a short staff, his fine wispy beard hanging like dripping, bedraggled threads, and his long, scrawny legs bowed almost as much as his back, was the Holy One. "No!" Triton yelled, as he plunged down the stepped street with his sword raised. But it was no use. He'd not travelled half the distance when the wizened Loris took hold of the lever that operated the colossal doors of the city's inner wall and threw it down. Iron wheels turned, and the ages-old apparatus began to clank inside its stone housing. "He is in league with the scale," Triton murmured wretchedly. "Our Sadhu has surrendered us to the enemy." With torches held above their heads, the flames spitting in the rain, thousands of red-rimmed eyes were shining in amazement at the opening doors. Poised outside the entrance, blinking suspiciously and licking their fangs, the assembled forces of the scale were an abhorrent, petrifying sight. Behind them, the first of the crocodiles had already clambered from the harbour and were glaring into the city, and all around their repulsive, scaly feet twisted a knot of venomous snakes, whose reared heads were swaying from side to side as their tongues flicked in and out of their mouths to taste the unfamiliar airs. Then from behind the nightmarish host of Gors-Garrigion, the high priest strode forward until he was standing in front of the Holy One. "Witless ape!" he shouted. With that, he raised his claws from the folds of his cloak, and all saw that upon them he wore 2 golden talons. Screeching with hideous laughter, he lashed out, but the loris did not flinch, and when the poisoned blades ripped through his throat, it was exposed and ready for them. At once the demonic army came charging through the entrance, whooping and screaming bloodthirsty oaths. Triton immediately ordered a detachment of squirrel archers to climb on the balconies above and shoot at the enemy from there. The rest of his host he told to stand firm and beware the blades of their foes. Before Triton's bloodied sword, 7 great rats had already fallen, but more came leaping to take their place, and their scimitars rang against the mongoose's blade. Several rows behind the main conflict, Thomas and Woodgett prepared themselves for the onslaught as the ranks began to thin and the ferocious army of the scale drew ever closer. Yelling hideously, a black rat cannoned into Thomas, and Master Stubbs collapsed beneath the crushing weight of the vile-smelling beast. Yet even as the venom-soaked claws came reaching for his neck, he thrust up with his dagger and pushed the blade clean through the fiend's windpipe. A horrific bubbling gurgle issued from the beast's choking maw, but to Thomas's dismay, his stroke had not been fatal. Then, to Woodgett's astonishment, Dimlin jumped to Thomas's aid, flourishing a silver-hilted sword retrieved from one of the fallen shrews. "Keep back!" the pale grey mouse blurted. At first, the rat chuckled darkly, and then a strange, shocked expression struck his ugly face as he leered at Dachrem, and he blinked in bewilderment. But whatever he had been about to utter was swiftly curtailed, for the treacherous mouse squeaked in mock horror and swiped the sword across the rat's neck. Around them, however, the uproar continued to blare, and, unable to dwell on the ghastly experience, Thomas picked up a sword and dashed across the rat's headless body to stop up the breach. Just then, agonizing screams issued from the attacking host as, through the gaping entrance, lumbered the largest crocodile, and up the narrow street it came, trudging, heedless of the creatures in its determined, destroying path, squashing everything beneath its pounding, splayed feet. With its immense tooth-filled jaws, it callously scooped up 7 shrieking cult members and devoured them with a toss of its head. Standing a safe distance away upon the base of a statue, the high priest rubbed his claws together triumphantly. The lesser servants were dispensable. They had served their purpose. Now the inhabitants of Hara would see that their paltry struggles were in vain. "We are lost," Triton muttered. Karim whirled round and shook him by the shoulders. "Then keep our memory alive. Gladly I will give my life if I can hope you have denied them what they wish." "In the green hereafter your place shall be set high, Karim Bihari," Triton said quickly. Swiftly he now leapt from the front line and shoved through the squealing shrews behind, calling for Thomas, Woodgett, and Dimlin. Master Stubbs gave a final scything sweep with his sword, then sprang back, and his place was immediately filled by 2 valiant musk shrews. "Hurry!" Woodgett urged, following Triton's retreating figure through the petrified crowd. At his side, Dachrem pranced excitedly, babbling in Dimmy's plaintive tones about how glad he was to be leaving this awful place. From the grisly scene of the battle, through the pouring, lashing rain, the mice and Chatangiri raced, vanishing into the storm-drenched darkness, ascending the terrace paths that wound about the slopes of the mountain. Below them, within the beleaguered street, the repellent form of the crocodile finally reached the Haran forces, and at last the age-old city of the Green was defeated. And the time had come for the high priest to claim the 8th fragment for the glory of his master. So, leaving the main body of his infernal host to finish slaughtering the inhabitants, he took a legion of rats and set off towards the mountain. Up the 1,000 steps Chatan and the mice had hastened, not pausing for breath, nor to glance down at the turmoil which ravaged the city streets below. "The downward road we must take," the mongoose told them. "It leads deep into the mountain's roots. There we must trust to Providence and avoid capture, for what we shall carry from here this night is beyond price." "The fragments," Thomas muttered. "Me and Wood shall go and fetch them." "No, Master Thomas. You have proven your skill with the blade and must remain with me," said Chatan. "Oh, it's all right, Tom," Woodjet said. "I can manage on my own." The mongoose narrowed his dark eyes. "One fragment is burden enough. Dimran can go with you. Give the other evil to him and be as quick as you can." Dachrem nodded deliriously. "Oh, Dimmy not dawdle. He help Woody gladly. Ha!" When they'd gone, the mongoose ran back into the storm-flooded fire chamber and peered out of the stone mouth to look down upon the troubled city. Then, suddenly, cutting through the air above them, there screeched a horrendous, terrified squeal. "Woodjet!" Thomas cried, spinning round and charging back through the cavern. As the field mouse's screams floated out into the night, Captain Chatan brandished his sword, but before he followed Thomas, he saw that far below, dark shapes were racing towards the bottom of the 1,000 steps. Up to the Holy One's chamber, Woodjet had led Dachrem. Into the livid green glare he scampered, over to where his bag lay propped against the curving wall. "Here be the piece old Mulligan kept. I'll take this. You get the other one, Dimmy." Dachrem's outstretched paws quivered with emotion as he beheld the gorgeous spectacle of the wondrous treasure. Wrung with emotion, he gazed on the splendour of the 8th fragment, which, to his adoring eyes, was the most beautiful sight he'd ever seen. "You finished?" Woodjet called. "Oh, yes. The time to end many things has come." "What be you a-playing at? There ain't no time." The field mouse's voice died on his lips, and his face was a portrait of blank incomprehension. Dimmy was almost unrecognizable, with the 8th fragment grasped in one set of claws, and the 2 curved blades glittering upon the other. Infinite malice disfigured his countenance, and the repellent snarl twisted over his mouth, drawing the thin lips back over the deep red gums. Dimmy?" Dachrem gave a sniggering hiss. "Dimmy was never here." "Dimmy, stop this. It ain't funny." The adept of the serpent stalked a little nearer, a mocking cackle rattling in his throat. Woodjet shrank back, and his eyes grew wide with terror, as, behind the pale grey mouse, he saw the switching tail slowly unpeel into 2 separate halves. "No, it ain't true! Green, save me!" "Such arrogance!" Dachrem spat. "To think you could deny us the last 2 fragments. Now, surrender to me the 9th piece, or must I tear it from your poisoned corpse?
Without a thought for his own safety, the field mouse suddenly lunged forward and, using all his strength, shoved the bag in Dachrem's face and then fled past him, swinging the bag in his fists as he raced for the door. But Dachrem rallied swiftly and, screeching with fury, bounded across the chamber to cut off Woodget's escape. "Spawn of the snake!" bawled a sudden, ferocious voice. Dachrem whisked round, and standing in the doorway with Thomas at his side was Captain Triton. "Lay down the 8th fragment," the mongoose commanded grimly. "I will not permit you to take it." "Permit? You have no authority here." "You waste your final breaths." As he spoke, the mongoose stabbed out with his sword, taunting the foul grey mouse, and Dachrem's laughter was stilled. "So be it," he swore. "The blade of Hara against the teeth of Sarpedon. Prepare to meet your precious green." As gold rang against steel, Dachrem pushed his head forward, and his snapping jaws bit into the mongoose's chest. Triton yelled in pain, and Dachrem spat a bleeding chunk of flesh onto the floor. Then, with a burst of strength, Triton hurled the adept from him, and when he came marauding back, flung his arm wide, and the tip of the blade cut a scarlet arc across Dachrem's body. Screeching, the creature stumbled back. "You wish to carve the skin from me? Look on me and die." With that, he raised his claws, and a horrendous splitting noise issued from his back as the fur fell in 2 hideous, shredded scraps. There, his true inner nature revealed at last, stood the thing that was Dachrem. As a lizard he appeared, yet it was an abomination of creation. Wet, slippery, dark green scales covered his repugnant body, from the tips of the forked tail to the squat crown of his square, grotesque head. Thomas's terror and revulsion overwhelmed him, and he staggered through the doorway, unable to compel his feet to take him back into that chamber. Then Dachrem lunged, his large, smooth head hunched into his powerful shoulders as his haunches bounded over the floor. The mongoose whirled about just in time to meet the golden knives which scored his arm. "Captain!" Woodget cried. Dachrem laughed hideously. "Feel the poison gnawing at your fibres, Captain. Soon it will devour you utterly." At his scaly feet, the captain flinched, and the torment of his wounds consumed him. Then, breathing feverishly, Dachrem turned, and his gaze fell upon Woodget. "Give it to me. Your custodianship is ended." "Never!" Dachrem sneered. Then, baring his fangs, he drew a deep breath and lunged for the field mouse's neck. A strangled scream echoed from the mountain, and the domed chamber quaked at the dreadful sound. Quivering, Woodget stared upwards, his terror bursting into relief. Above him, Dachrem's snake-like face bristled with woeful astonishment as he gazed down at the silver blade which now thrust out from a wound in his breast. Behind him, his courage mastered at last, stood Thomas. His tail lashing about him, Dachrem went crashing against the oval stone which he slammed into with the full force of his stumbling fall. Outside the mountain, in the middle of the great likeness's forehead, the glimmering gem trembled and shook. Inside the domed chamber, Dachrem staggered to his feet. Suddenly Thomas rushed forward and, spending all his strength, gave the reptile an almighty shove. Back Dachrem floundered, his scaly body crashing against the stone a second time, and with that his fate was sealed. Out from the rock the great oval jewel fell, and, flailing wildly upon the edge a moment longer with the 8th fragment still in his grasp, Dachrem toppled after. At the foot of the mountain the forces of the scale gathered around his broken form, recognizing it to be one of the great adepts. The high priest let out a covetous hiss. "The fragment!" Stooping over the battered reptilian body, he tore the jade shell from Dachrem's claws, but even as he held it aloft to the foul cheers of his followers, Dachrem stirred. "The end is indeed here," he uttered, his speech riddled with pain. "The last fragment is there, high in the mountain." Spinning around, the high priest squinted up through the darkness. Then, leaving Dachrem to perish, he swept up the stairs, and a legion of Sarpedon's disciples raced after him. High above in the domed chamber, another, more tragic scene was taking place. Thomas and Woodgett knelt by Triton's side, but there was nothing they could do for the mongoose. "Tom, us can't abandon the captain to die on his own." Thomas leaned down and grabbed Woodgett by the shoulders. "Listen, it's up to us now. We're the only ones left to keep them horrors out there from getting Mulligan's fragment. There's a job still to be done, and there's no one else but us left to do it." Woodgett rose and wiped the tears from his eyes. "Right you are, Tom." Thomas hurried to the doorway, stooping to pick up the mongoose's sword as he ran. "There's only one place we can go," he shouted. "Where's that?" Woodgett cried, racing after him. At the top of the stairs, Thomas paused, then said flatly, "Singapore." Mother Lotus, or Ma Skillet as she was more commonly known by her customers, sat in her creaking chair behind the bar and puffed on the long-stemmed clay pipe she held in her podgy claws. The proprietor of the Lotus Parlour was a bloated, middle-aged brown rat. Yet the fur which covered her flabby face was powdered white with flour. 3 beauty spots peppered her left cheek, and through one of her nostrils she wore a silver ring. That night the Lotus Parlour was relatively quiet. The all-too-familiar ugly rogues were huddled over their drinks, a muttering group of bamboo rats, a filthy, squint-eyed ermine, 3 sly-looking weasels with scars on their faces and knives in their belts, a Burmese water vole who'd had rather too much of the shady establishment's liquor, and several black bilge rats who kept to themselves and spoke to no one. Ma Skillet rapped her fan upon the slop-spilt bar. Then, waddling between the tables, the proprietor of the Lotus Parlour blustered towards the drunken vole, who greeted her with a rousing chorus of his warbling song until she pushed him outside onto the slithering mud. Clapping her paws together, she returned over the sawdust-covered floor of the bar just as the entrance swung open, and into the light radiating from the suspended candle came 2 figures. The bar's buzzing talk died immediately, and every ugly head turned to eye the newcomers with suspicion. Thomas peered about the murky room, his eyes watering in the malodorous atmosphere, and looked for an empty table. At his side, Woodgett gathered the abundant folds of his hood about his crinkling nose, whilst keeping a tight hold of the bag slung over his shoulder. 12 days had passed since their flight from the forces of the Scale, and they could hardly believe they'd managed to survive and evade capture during their long journey by riverboat and ship. Since departing Hara, they'd not trusted anyone. Every creature they met was a possible member of the serpent cult, so they kept their own company and talked seldom in voices above the level of a whisper for fear of being overheard. "Do you really think we'll find him here?" Woodgett asked doubtfully. "No, but someone's bound to have seen him. If Simoon is in Singapore like the only one said, then this is as good a place to start asking as any." "Mafkang Saya!" rang a sudden terse voice behind them. Startled, the mice looked up, and there was Ma Skillet standing with her claws folded on her breast, her white face staring at them truculently. "Good evening," Thomas said politely. "Ah, you are Britlanders. Many Englishers come here buy liquor, but they can no stay if no buy liquor." Thomas understood and reached inside his cloak for the last of their money. Forgive me. Could me and my friend have a drink, please?"
Mother Lotus get good, strong quenches for you, Mr. The mice looked at one another, and Thomas cleared his throat. Well, this is Master Codweed, and I'm... Widget broke in quickly. He's Mr. Triton. Ma Skillet bowed to them both, but gave Thomas a lurid wink and trundled away. She didn't ask what sort of drinks we wanted, Widget hissed. Well, I should think they only served one sort anyway. Carrying 2 wooden cups which frothed over with a horrendous brown scum-covered concoction, Ma Skillet returned. What you do in Singapore? Well, my friend and me, we're looking for someone, weren't we, Cudweed? What? Oh, yes, that's be right. Who you seek? Thomas coughed. Well, we're told there's a fortune-teller, a prophet somewhere roundabouts. You no need teller of fortunes. Mother Lotus, she know what Lady Fate has in store for you. Well, I think we'd best go, Thomas muttered. Where you go? You not leave till you drink. No need pay. Mother Lotus, she buy. Pouring a further cupful of brown liquor, she reached under the bar and took from a shelf a small glass bottle containing a fine grey powder, which she secretly sprinkled into the drink. Now, mousey do anything Mother Lotus wish, she cackled to herself. Thomas took the cup from her and raised it to his mouth. As soon as the first drop passed his lips, the rat began to whistle a peculiar haunting tune between her teeth. The vile-tasting liquor burned in his throat, but after the first swig the wretched flavour didn't seem half so bad, and by the third it was almost palatable. From some great distance away, or so he thought, he heard Widget's high voice filled with mounting concern call out, "Tom! This ain't time for a doze! Tom! Tom!" But to Widget's dismay, Thomas sank deeper into the trance Ma Skillet was weaving about him. "What are you doing to him? Oh, missus, stop! Bring poor Tom out of it! Mother Lotus like have play with he first. He has now." Turning back to the mesmerized Thomas, she brought her face close to his and blew lightly upon it. Thomas's head nodded and swayed as he tried to focus on the flabby visage, but Ma Skillet's unwieldy features melted into a familiar and beloved countenance. "Who you see before you?" she asked coaxingly. "Bass." A glad smile had alighted upon Thomas's face, and with his mind's eye he gazed on the wondrous vision that continued to grow and unfurl before him. "Kiss me, Tommy. You know you want to." Thomas held his breath and reached out to caress the mouse-maiden's comely face, but all he touched was the flower-plastered fur of Ma Skillet. Braying whoops of delight issued from the other patrons, and Widget glared at them murderously. "Quiet! It ain't funny!" "I'm scared, Bess," Thomas continued. "We've got what the enemy's after. I don't want to be caught and be poisoned like the others. I wish we'd never seen the 9th fragment." All round Widget the room seemed to darken, and he swallowed nervously. What had begun as a cruel, teasing game by Ma Skillet had ended in disaster. Now everyone in the bar knew who they were and the evil that they were carrying. Ma Skillet pointed at the leather bag. "You show Mother Lotus what you keep in there." Widget backed away. "I won't." Ma Skillet sneered, and behind her the sinister crowd hissed. "So, from Hara you escape, and straight to me you run. Such empty heads you is." Turning back to Thomas, Ma Skillet commanded him to draw his sword. "You give back to Triton."
Thomas strode closer, and the tip of the sword blade was brought ever nearer to Woodget's chest.
"Now," the rat uttered viciously, "stab he through the heart." "Tom," Woodget wailed, "please."
Not knowing what he was doing, Thomas drew back the sword and plunged it forward. At once there was a blistering light as the sword burst into blue flame.
"What happened?" squawked Mouse Skillet. "Where's sword go?"
"Be quiet, servant of the twining tyrant, lest you are thrust into the hottest part of the flames and your wickedness melted clean off your bones." Standing in the open doorway, with a great bulging pack upon his back, was a diminutive and startling figure, but to the mice his presence was more welcome than a whole legion of Haran warriors. Clothed in the familiar crimson velvet gown, embroidered with golden symbols, was Simoon. "I am come to liberate my young friends."
"Alas!" came a shrill voice, "you have lost."
Simoon and the others turned, and striding through the open doorway came the dishevelled figure of the water vole whom Mouse Skillet had previously thrown out.
"Did you truly believe your journey from Hara was unmarked?" he asked Thomas. "It was I who allowed you to venture here unmolested, but now the trap is sprung and your emissaries entered."
Before him, an unnatural column of swirling blackness reached up to the ceiling, and then with the trembling of the air the blackness fell away in light strangling ripples, but the vole was nowhere to be seen. Woodget caught his breath, for there, in the creature's stead, there now towered a menacing and sinister figure swaddled in a black hooded cloak. "At the last we meet." The malevolent nasal tones addressed the Jerboa, and the mice cringed at the sound of it, for now they recognized that pitiless voice. There, standing before them, was the high priest himself. "Many times have I sensed your presence," his foul voice continued, "but into the eyes of death do you now gaze. The end of your reviled world has come, and the second reign of the glorious master is dawning." "Beware the wrath of Simoon. Neri Akitru Baraka," the prophet cried, and at once the room was ablaze with a dazzling explosion of fierce blue energy. All about the seedy bar the searing spikes of sapphire flame rampaged, driving the rats, weasels, and ermine insane with terror. But in the middle of the miraculous fiery spectacle, encompassed by Simoon's unleashed might, the high priest loomed tall and unafraid. For a terrible moment the two powers grappled with each other. Around the high priest black lightnings burst into existence, clashing ferociously with Simoon's blistering forces. Then darkness returned to the lotus parlour, and Woodget stared at Simoon in despair. Out of breath, his strength and power spent, the prophet wilted and fell senseless to the ground, leaving Thomas and Woodget to face the high priest alone. And so, kicking and struggling, the mice were dragged from the lotus parlour. Then one of the bamboo rats cut the straps of Simoon's pack and hoisted his unconscious form onto a bony shoulder before following the others outside. Alone with Mouse Skillet, the high priest lifted the field mouse's bag and, closing his eyes to savour the moment, reached inside. Mother Lotus hung her head respectfully. "The Dark Sovereign, he returned?" "Yes, after all this long, lonely time, the ages of his exile are complete," the high priest answered, caressing the gleaming gold traceries with his claws. "Come to the Black Temple." And swirling his cloak about him, he strode into the night. Presently, as the rowing boat journeyed out of the river into the bay and onto the sea beyond, Thomas looked up at the foul face of the high priest and was engulfed in despair. The 9 stars of Sarpedon were already beginning to blaze, heralding the return of the dark despoiler's spirit to the living plane, and in that bleak hour Thomas's spirits were utterly vanquished. The cult of the snake had beaten them all. When they were far from the shore, the high priest unfurled his cloak and gazed lustfully upon the ninth fragment once more, imagining the glory that awaited him under his unhallowed sovereign's slaughterous regime. Directly behind them, the bilge rats continued to heave on the oars, and the boat shot unerringly through the dense night until Thomas began to see black shapes appear in the shadowy distance. As they drew closer, he saw in the soft moonlight that they were jagged spears of rock which reared up from the ocean bed, clustering in a lethal, bitter reef. Through narrow waterways between spires of stone the little boat went, winding through a maze of secret shallows, and not once did the keel touch or scrape against any of the savage, lurking boulders. Finally, the boat drew alongside the roughly hewn wall, and the rats and weasels yanked in the oars. Ascending to the top of the steep flight as Ma Skillet lumbered after, the high priest turned and pointed to the captives who remained below. In the boat, Thomas and Woodgett saw the ugly faces of 3 bamboo rats come leering into view above them, and claws as sharp as knives bit into their skin as they were hauled up and flung heedlessly over their shoulders before being heaved up the steps. A clangorous report echoed about the cavernous harbour as the rat-bearing Thomas gave an iron door a fierce kick, and it swung open to reveal a slightly wider passage beyond, which was lit by flickering torchlight. Into this dipping way the prisoners were carried, and the path twisted and turned for some distance before abruptly opening out into a monstrous chamber, a monumental cavern, in which had been raised the altar of Suruth Scaroffion. From the floor of solid rock, a wide flight of steps rose with regal majesty to a raised platform, where 4 massive pillars of black marble towered upwards to support the lofty ceiling. High above, where the vaulted roof towered out of reach of lantern light, a vast and perfect circle gaped in the chiselled rock, and through it streamed the light of 9 bright stars. Yet the whole panorama of this awesome reviled spectacle was nothing compared to that which dominated the entire horrible scene. Rearing higher than the towering pillars, up to where the roof melted into the darkness, was a colossal and nightmarish statue, the gigantic image of Sarpedon the Mighty, with scales wrought from the purest gold and patterns picked out with emerald and sapphire. Staring up at the terrifying spectacle, Woodgett shut his eyes and turned away, back to the relative darkness that spread before the wide marble steps upon which their captors were standing. Yet when the field mouse opened his eyes again, he uttered a whimpering groan. The unbounded gloom which stretched below the temple was not empty. Thousands upon thousands of squint-eyed, malignant creatures were jostling and squirming in the murk. That night they had all come expecting the revels to be high and overflowing with blood, for never in any of their lives had the constellation of Sarpedon appeared in the firmament, and their pledged souls thrilled to the knowledge that the 9 stars meant their evil sovereign was close to the living plain. Into the temple now strode the great adepts, chosen creatures with the power to slough their skin and walk unclad in the scales of their true nature. Proud and haughty they were, those select few, whose skill and knowledge of the base occult arts had elevated them to such an infamous rank. Woodgett stared at them fearfully. "What they doing, Tom? What they got in their fists?" Thomas had already guessed, but there was no time to answer, for at that moment the drums rolled again, and into the temple came the high priest, and after him Mother Lotus. "Servants of Sarpedon!" he shrieked. "Know now that the fortresses of our enemies have been utterly conquered." Basking in the screaming tributes and adoration, the high priest stepped aside and with a flourish of his claw gave a signal to the adepts. As one, they tore the wrappings from the bundles they held, and there in their clutches they held the 8 plundered fragments. As the deathly light pulsed and beat from the pieces of jade, the chosen ones raised their claws above their heads, and gasps of alarm and unease issued from the stunned, thunderstruck crowds. Casting aside his cloak, the high priest brought out the remaining segment which Mulligan and his ancestors had kept safe and secret throughout the ages. "Too long has his dark majesty been banished from the waking world, but now the hour is upon us. Sarpedon will rear amongst us again. The eternal night has come at last." Lifting the fragment over the altar, he shrieked with rapture, and the chosen ones moved their radiant charges ever closer. The golden edges of the reunited pieces thrashed feverishly. With a resounding discordant note, the fragments locked together, and there upon the altar was a great and fabulous egg. "Behold! The vessel which will receive our dear Lord's spirit!" The congregation threw their knives and cutlasses into the air, shrieking in demented voices, "Sarpedon! Sarpedon!" Then, as Woodgett and Thomas stared heavenward, they saw 9 rays of searing light come streaking from the constellation of the Serpent. As an immense column of pure light, the rays shot into the unhallowed sanctum, bringing with them the freezing winter of the infinite void, and upon the altar their frosty fires crackled and sparked. Now the egg was wreathed in the lurid fires, completely enclosed within their bleak, glacial tongues. Then Thomas heard Woodgett's small and desperate voice call out, "Tom, look, Simoon, he be coming round." In slow, painful movements, the prophet was awakening, returning from that dark forgetfulness to which his grappling with the high priest had dispatched him. Wearily he lifted his sandy-coloured head, his brambling whiskers twitching as he opened his large black eyes, and beheld the terrible sight before him. Yet still the cold fires crackled about the great egg, as the demonic exiled spirit descended from the celestial confines. "Feel the sovereign's might and majesty," the high priest called. "Let his sublime power flow through you all. Let us greet him in the essence of our devotion." Before the altar, the adepts were rapidly sloughing their skins, and a heap of furry, bristling pelts lay piled upon the black marble as they paraded their ghastly characters, flinging their glistening arms in the air, dragging their newtish tails behind their gruesome, spine-spiking bodies. Watching them and clapping with approval, Mother Lotus cackled and then ripped from her head the flour-powdered face. Like a vast pot-bellied toad she appeared, with great bulging eyes and a pale, blotch-covered throat. The bloated scale and wart-ridden horror that was Ma Skillet stooped to retrieve her golden snake-adorned dagger, then waddled towards Woodgett, her splayed feet slip-slapping upon the floor. Nearly fainting from terror, the field mouse watched her lumbering approach, the flabby reptilian hide quivering like a sour and mouldering jelly. Thomas couldn't look, and waited for his friend's death cries to resound in his ears until his turn came. But the fearsome shrieks never sounded. "Misbegotten horror! Adipose abomination! Again I say, be still!" Ma Skillet was hurled backwards by an unseen power. "Simoon!" Thomas yelled. To this desperate end, I and the other members of the Green Council have guided your felonious footsteps. See now how your plots are destroyed, and the schemes of your tyrannous overlord are beaten into the mire of your own making." Upon the altar, the light which beat from the great egg was fluctuating. Its ghastly pallor flickered unsteadily, and within its depths the wriggling shape was twitching and jolting as though racked and stabbed with pain. "This we decided in the great long ago," the Jerboa proclaimed. "For though the honourable order of magicians and enchanters who worked for the Green's greater glory were slain within the first temple, not all perished. I alone remain to oversee the final end of the Dark Despoiler." With a sickening, splitting sound, the egg began to fall to pieces. Onto the floor the jade crashed, and into a mildewed dust it exploded. Speechless with grief and fury, the high priest turned to look on the Jerboa. "What have you done?" "Sarpedon! He is! He is!" "Never again can his blasphemous spirit knit slime and sinew together, for the work of the past is shattered. The ninth and final fragment has been hallowed throughout the long ages. When the egg was made whole again, it was addled. The shell is broken unto dust, and can never be repaired." A terrible growl issued from the high priest's throat, and he rushed forward to destroy the sanctimonious creature. Yet Simoon seemed unperturbed. Lifting his paw again, an invisible force cannoned into his attacker, and he was sent hurtling to the far corners of the temple, crying shrilly in fright. Then Simoon reached into one of his many pockets and cast a cloud of blue powder into the air, which immediately burst into a spluttering display. Into the crowding hordes his magic cascaded, and to the dismay of the reptilian apparitions which were gathered within the cavern, the sparks jumped onto the cast-off skins and buried themselves into the matted hides, kindling suddenly into raging fires that devoured the sloughed pelts completely, until only ash remained. Widget was bouncing up and down with unrivalled joy. "I knowed you was a great magician! I knowed it all the time!" The Jerboa chuckled, then looked up sharply as if he'd heard something that alarmed him. "Come, we waste valuable time." With that, he hared down the great steps and made for the door which the rats had originally carried them through, and Thomas and Widget raced after him. At the rear of the temple, crawling from the place Simoon's powers had thrown him, the high priest looked on the chaos of his followers and knew the meaning of defeat. Suddenly, from high above him, there came the sound of creaking metal. Surely it could not be. Surely even the Dark One could not perform such an astounding feat. Rearing into the darkness, the gigantic golden image of Scarophion was shuddering. The massive, repulsive head twisted and shook, and the jaws clanged open and shut. "My lord! Scarophion the mighty, I, your high priest, welcome your blissful return." The Dark Despoiler had indeed cheated the designs of the Green Council, for though he was not clothed in flesh, his iniquitous spirit had fled from the egg and seized possession of his own mammoth likeness. The golden jaws sprang open, and from the titanic throat there streamed a strangling black vapour. Through the tunnels Simoon and the two mice ran until, breathlessly, they came to the dark harbour and climbed aboard a small rowing boat. Make haste, Master Stubbs, quickly untie the rope." Thomas obeyed, and as Widget settled down within the craft, the field mouse giggled merrily. "Poh, he ain't called Stubbs, Master Simoon. From here on in, old Tom's called Triton." Simoon hushed him. "I fear the danger is not yet past." "What be a worrying ye?" Simoon shook his head. "It may be nothing, and yet—" Woodget looked at the jerboa in surprise, then turned around to gaze at the vast rocky hill which loomed from the waters behind them as a horrible booming roar resounded from it. "As I feared," Simoon whispered to himself. "He's not beaten." Out from the temple the statue of Scaroffion came. Into the upper airs he heaved his glittering, gem-encrusted body, and sitting astride his neck, his claws gripped tight about the horns that twisted back from the gleaming skull, was the high priest. Over the rock the idol slithered, pulling the last of its flexing coils from within the temple, and to Woodget's increasing horror, the giant serpent writhed its monstrous way down to the water and flowed into the sea. Towards the tiny vessel the immense head lunged, and a torrent of yellow flame went shooting from the great black throat. In the boat the occupants were swallowed by despair, and Woodget turned around to see how far they still had to go before they were clear of the reef, then muttered at his own foolishness. They'd never be able to outpace that glittering monster. Thomas was determined not to abandon hope. "Simoon, can you summon a mist, like the one that surrounds the silver ship of Hara?" Simoon closed his eyes, murmuring under his breath, and as Thomas heaved on the oars, the surrounding waters began to bubble, and wisps of white vapour rose into the air. "I need more," Thomas yelled, "a great big bank of it." Yet hot in pursuit came Goscarigern, cleaving a path through the mounting fog. In the growing light of the morning, the huge jaws shone brightly as they yawned open, and into the dense white fog a river of flame erupted. It missed the boat by the merest fraction, but sitting closest to the blasting inferno, Woodget fell back from the tremendous heat as a fount of steam broiled upwards, and at his side Simoon shook his head. "In a moment he will have us." "Not if I can help it," Thomas shouted at him. "Turn the rudder sharply, we're going back into the reef." Back into the treacherous rocks Thomas rowed the little craft as the idol twisted around, and the opulent, ghastly head came bursting through the thick, clinging clouds. Swiftly it came, yet Simoon pulled hard on the tiller and the boat jerked sideways, following the twisting path of the channel. Up into the fog the statue soared, towering like a fabulous minted mountain, its loathly head rising above the topmost swirl of cloud. Then, with a deafening roar, the golden nightmare plunged back through the mist. "Now, my lords," screeched the high priest, "let your supreme magnitude topple down and dash them to death!" In the boat, Thomas threw Simoon a desperate glance. "Now or never!" he yelled. Suddenly the keel of the boat scraped against the sharp rocks beneath as they left the safe channel. Thomas grabbed hold of Woodget and yelled, "Jump clear! Get out!" Leaping from the boat, they splashed into the surrounding water. Too late, Scaroffion and his servants saw the impending danger. Careering helplessly into the steadfast stone, the gilt head exploded with 1,000 sparkling splinters, and, projected like precious missiles from its crumpling features, flew a horde of spinning, scintillating treasures. Then down crashed the serpent's body, and into the sea it thundered with an almighty, foaming tumult. The fear of his reign was finished, and the new day which rose about Thomas and Woodget gleamed clean and bright. "Simoon, where is he?" The mice stared at each other desolately, but then a mumbling groan issued from behind the great gold-bestrewn rock, and with hope surging inside them they raced over to where the jerboa lay, groggy and bleeding. "Ooh, now, don't you go a-fretting now," Woodget soothed. "Everything be fine." "Ah, ha, ha, ha," sneered a hissing, rabid voice. "There you are wrong. Staggering from around the rock with a broken shard of gold in his claws came the high priest. Pushing himself forward, he lifted the spike of gold in his claws and aimed it at the Jerboa's head. But Thomas grabbed hold of him and flung him against the clattering wreck of the statue's ruptured head. Brutally the two fought, the golden shard clashing against the splintered oar Thomas held. Fiercely the strokes swiped the air. Once Thomas caught the high priest a glancing blow across the arm, but the creature rallied straight away and flew at him all the more viciously. In the end, Thomas was pinned against the rock, with the glinting spike pressed at his throat. "So perish all who come between Sarpedon and his designs." Thomas shrank against the stone and waited for the shard to drive into his neck. Yet the high priest continued to leer at him, and Thomas suddenly saw a trickle of blood drip from the cruel, misshapen mouth. Down fell the servant of Scaroffion, and there, revealed behind him, stood Woodget, with a steel fang ripped from the statue's jaws, clenched in his little fist, and both it and his paw were drenched in the high priest's blood. Shivering, the field mouse stared down at the lifeless body. "That's for our friends, Mr. Mulligan, Captain Chatan, and Karim." Gently, Thomas put his arm about his friend's shoulders and took the weapon from his paw. "It's all right, Woods. The enemy's finished now." "Verily," Simoon's rich tones interrupted, and when they turned they saw that he was sitting up in the shallows, wringing out the velvet folds of his robe. "Yonder is the silver ship of Hara, come to give whatever assistance she may." Woodget caught his breath. "But who be aboard her?" "All those in the city who were not slain." Woodget sighed. "Then Hara will be rebuilt. I'm glad." Then he smiled up at Thomas and in a small, meek voice asked, "Is it over, Tom? Is all the horridness ended?" "Yes, Woods, it's over." When 4 days had passed, and the celebrations were finally over, the white and silver ship returned to India. It was a bright, sunny morning in Singapore, and by the docks they said their goodbyes. "Farewell, my friends," Simoon the prophet said solemnly. "In the great battle against Scaroffion you have proved your worth." Thomas and Woodget watched his small figure go shambling through the dockyard until he disappeared. "Well, it's just you and me again then, Tom. When's that ship due that'll take us straight home?" Idly, Thomas kicked a pebble. "Oh, it'll be here soon enough." "You fancy a walk till then, Master Triton?" "Well, all right, matey, but only if you'll stop calling me that ridiculous name." Woodget chuckled, and, chatting amiably, they wandered along the dockside and down towards the river-bank, where the Lotus Parlour stood empty beneath the rickety wooden pier. Thomas glanced back and saw that a large, shabby shape was hobbling towards them. Closer the beggar creature came, tirelessly shaking a bowl in supplication. "Spare a coin, sir, spare a coin." "Oh, I'm sorry, we don't have none." "Hang on, Tom. She's welcome to the bit of bread and cheese we was saving for our lunch." And so the field mouse began to unfasten his bag and rummage around inside it. Very softly, a faint, uncanny melody drifted upon the air as the shabby-looking creature began to whistle through her teeth, a haunting tune that Woodget thought he'd heard somewhere before. "Here's a couple of nice biscuits." Woodget's voice faded, for he saw that his friend seemed suddenly pale and drawn. A blankness had settled across his face, and his eyes were glazed and vacant. "Oh, I don't like this," Woodget muttered, turning to the beggar. "Could you give me a lift with him? I reckon he needs to—" And again his voice trailed into nothingness, for at last he recognized the eerie whistling. Standing before him was Ma Skillet, she who had escaped from the Black Temple with her frazzling hide. "What do you want?" Ma Skillet said nothing, but stooped over Thomas. "Stop it!" Woodjet cried. But Mother Lotus waved her claw before her, and mechanically Thomas turned to face the field mouse. "Listen, Tom! It's me, remember?" But Thomas didn't know him. Under the spell of the abhorrent creature, he was powerless, and when she instructed him to push the field mouse into the water, he was compelled to obey. Into the river Woodjet splashed, and he thrashed his arms feverishly. Tom! Tom! You knows I can't swim!" Ma Skillet cackled to herself, and watched with satisfaction as the little field mouse's head bobbed under the surface, emerging a second later, spluttering and retching, until at last he sank below the water and did not return. Rubbing her claws, Mother Lotus lumbered away and vanished out of memory. When the day was over and the evening grew chill, Thomas stirred from the enchantment and stared stupidly about him. "Woods? Woods? Where—" And then he remembered. And in stilted flashes, he knew all that he had done. Thomas leapt into the river and dived for his friend's drowned body. But the tides had taken it, and after many hours of relentless searching, the mouse clambered back onto the pier, and in a thin, dreadful voice that was filled with anguish and unquenchable remorse, he screamed. Gwen Triton crept back into the snug candlelit room on board the Cutty Sark, and with a sorry shake of the head looked around at the mess that was scattered about her husband's sleeping form. Thomas was slumped over the small desk, and, biting her lip, she glanced over his shoulder. But the pages were devoid of any writing, as she had suspected they might be, and, despairing of the wreck he'd made, she sat down upon the bunk and sobbed silently. Yet, far away, in the once great and fabled city of Hara, a mongoose was scaling the 1,000 steps that ascended the mountain, and at her side, clinging to her paw, her young toddling grandson. "Remember this day, little Chatan, for the Sadhu is most holy and devout. You must not ask him any questions." "Why, Nana Shaban? Will he punish me?" Shaban led little Chatan round the ledge until they stood before the crouched shape. "Sadhu," Shaban said gently. "Oh, Shaban. No, let me see. Who's this young warrior you brought along for me?" "It is my grandson, Sadhu, little Chatan." As she said this, Shaban watched the Holy One's face, but not a flicker of remembrance showed there. "Do you never even have a hint of memory?" she murmured. "Is there nothing you can recall?" "Oh, the songs of Zena are too strong for that. When she brought me to this place, she'd sustained me for many, many days, and for that I cannot condemn her. Yet I wish I could speak to you of—" "You have a fine grandson, Shaban," the Holy One said briskly. "It pleases me to see him. Now, permit me to return to my meditation." Shaban nodded and led little Chatan away. "Can we visit him again, Nana Shaban?" "Oh yes, little Chatan, we may." The boy smiled. He liked the Holy One and thought he looked very wise and serious. even if he was a field mouse.